Hello everybody, this is Ben Hanson from MinnMax. MinnMax is a Patreon about games, friends, and getting better, and this is the oral history of PopCap. As you can see from the length of this thing, we're going for breadth here. There's going to be some jump cuts in here. It's trying to boil down everybody's story, but despite everybody we talk to, there are still hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people that made PopCap what it is. So thanks to everybody who has been involved with PopCap throughout its history, and the people that are still there now. EA declined to be a part of this, but hats off to everybody still working at PopCap as well. If you enjoy thorough content like this, we'd always appreciate you if you subscribe to MinnMax's YouTube channel, checked out our interviews, checked out the MinnMax Show podcast, or went over to patreon.com/MinnMax with 2 N's, where you can unlock the full podcast version of the oral history of PopCap, as well as the podcast version of our interviews, the deepest dives, everything like that. Thanks for your help keeping independent games media rolling. But without further ado, here's the oral history of PopCap.
You know, it's emotionally complicated to look back at PopCap. There was a lot, right? There's a lot of emotions, a lot of things in a very long journey. So there's no like light conversation about it in some ways.
They came up with this puzzle game and then they turned it into like a freaking empire.
It was just like, oh my God, there's a Jeopardy question about Bejeweled. What the hell?
They never tried to force a specific game framework. They wanted to make games which were just joyful and unique and special.
The level of experimentation and iteration that went into the games was really astounding.
Their instincts for what is a good game were so right on all the time.
It doesn't seem dated, it doesn't seem old, and it's still as fun as it was when I first played it. Like, you and I could sit down and try to make a list of game studios that have made one game. Now, how many games did PopCap make like that? Like 7, 8?
Oh my gosh, Peggle, are you kidding me? Peggle was my jam. I mean, I love PopCap. When we were there, people would say, you know, if you cut me, I bled PopCap.
It was fun to wake up in the morning knowing you were going to work for PopCap.
I sometimes think about what we did at PopCap, and I sometimes get philosophical around that journey.
That's what I want people to really learn from the PopCap experiment, is that you can be crazy successful and also take care of all the people that got you there.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Jason Kapalka. I guess I was one of the co-founders of PopCap Games.
I like the phrasing of "I guess."
I can assure you that I was.
Well, hey, do you want to go back in time and walk me through the first time you met John and Brian?
Yeah, John Vechey and Brian Feet, who are the other two founders of PopCap. That was actually probably would have been, I think, like 1998 or 99.
My name is John Vechey. I am one of the co-founders of a company called PopCap Games. So Brian and I met in university at Purdue University in Indiana. And he and I had a programming class together, and we were also in the same dorm, but we met in programming class. And he was a very good programmer who'd been doing it a long time. I was not a very good programmer, and I hadn't been doing it a very long time. We made this game called ARC. It was called Attack, Retrieve, Capture, ARC. I
was working at Total Entertainment Network doing the various odd things. It is, and one of the things that we were supposed to be doing was commissioning and finding and publishing online games. And one of the games I sort of found lying around on the internet was this game called Attack, Retrieve, Capture. And it was kind of a fun game. It was basically, I would describe it in modern terms, it was essentially, it was kind of Counter-Strike with saucers from a top-down perspective.
And, it quickly got, what at the time was an incredible amount of players, right? We were like, 60 to 100 daily players were playing ARC. And so it was pretty sweet. And we're in college. And so it's like, that's really cool. And then we got an email from Jason saying, I'm Jason. I'm with this company called Total Entertainment Network. This seems kind of cool. I'd love to chat. And then we started, and his name was Warpig.
And it turned out to be these two kids in Indiana who were, I think they were like working out of a trailer park, drinking Mountain Dew and stuff like this.
Well, why don't we fly out to San Francisco? And we're like, well, look, we really, we think we're going to go with this English company. He's like, it's okay if you do. No obligations. Come out, see what we got. We're like, okay, why not, right? And I thought San Francisco was in New Orleans. Not New Orleans, but in Louisiana.
What?
Yeah, it's from the Midwest in like India, small town Indiana, Wisconsin, right? So
I don't think you can use that as an excuse, dude.
Yeah, I am going to use that. Yeah, I can't use it to you. Most people, it works fine. They're like, oh, the Midwest.
Yeah, MinnMax, we're very proud of our Minnesota education system, man.
Yeah, Indiana. It's a worse place. No, so I was shocked when we got to California. I was like, what the f-? And then so we spent like 3 days in California. We were 19, so Jason had no idea what to do with us. He's like, here's these 19-year-olds. I don't know what to do with someone if I can't drink with them to cure my social anxiety. And so we ended up like just going around and doing things and then playing games at his place. And it was pretty cool.
So they're kind of like these, I think they'll admit that they were kind of these goofy kids from Indiana. So yeah, they were a little kind of, I think, surprised to be out in San Francisco.
We had no idea what to think of Jason. Let me describe you, Jason, right? He's a few years out of like rural Canada in Edmonton. He himself is like a fish out of water. And then we're like extra fishes out of water. And so we could talk about games, but really that was about it. Right? That was the limit of what we had in common at the time. But we did have really good conversations about games and then ended up partnering with them. And then he was our producer and really just had great suggestions on how to make the game better.
I think 2000, we all had kind of gotten sick of our existing jobs and thought that we could do a better job on our own. So yeah, we decided kind of to quit and start our own company.
And so you were kind of the businessman. Was that your role, or how would you explain like the different dynamics of the three here?
Oddly, I was definitely not the business guy. At that time, I was the creative guy. I was the game designer / artist / sound effects guy / whatever guy. And Brian was the technical guy, basically programmed everything. And John was our business guy. As with a lot of that sort of startup kind of story, sometimes your ignorance is your biggest advantage. If you kind of knew a little bit more, you would probably not do it because you'd realize, like, for example, when we started PopCap, that was basically right in the middle of the first .com crash. So, and again, in retrospect, it was obvious at the time. I was like, that's kind of weird. All these people I know are moving out of San Francisco and losing their jobs. I wonder, strange. I don't know what's up. We had started off with a few weird experiments. We had done a strip poker game, bizarrely, which the idea was that we would, that we didn't really want to do strip poker, but the idea was that we'd make this strip poker engine and then sell it off to people and use that money for our own projects. But as it turned out, we just didn't have the heart to be involved in the porn industry in any fashion. So we made probably the world's only PG rated strip poker game. And
so it's just the three of you thinking, what is the most surefire way to make money? And the answer was strip poker.
Yeah, it was kind of the thought. That was like as everyone has it. Let's do this thing that makes money and that'll fund our real projects. The problem we had was that the company that we started initially was called Sexy Action Cool, which was a name that kind of was just picked up at random because the URL was available and it came off of a movie poster in someone's basement. I think it was that Desperado, that Antonio Banderas movie. And there's for some reason that the movie blurb said "Sexy Action Cool!" ! So that became the name of the company, which was fine initially because we didn't really think anyone would ever care. We assumed we were not going to be a consumer-facing company. We figured we would just be making games and then, selling them or licensing them to larger companies.
Was there any connection between Sexy Action Cool and then Foxy Poker? Was it that idea of, we have sexy in our name for the studio, we should probably make a game that is sexy? Was it that simple?
No, actually it was all, there's no real thought about it at all. Foxy Poker again was just, it seemed like it was a name that was available, and Sex Action Cool again took about 5 seconds to decide on. And then when we had to change that to something more family friendly, the PopCap name came pretty quickly too. Basically, I liked the word pop because it sounded fairly friendly and all that. And so started working down the list of various pop kind of URLs to see what was available. And so if PopCap was down on the list pretty far. So if Pop Frog had been available, we probably would be called Pop Frog. So it was, as with a lot of these things, it was kind of punk rock in terms of not exactly being carefully considered or anything.
Yeah. Just, did you have any concerns about the name? Was there any debate about?
The only issue we had with PopCap was that sometimes, what do we have? There's a bit of confusion over what it meant. Like people said, "Is that a PopCap? Is that a thing? Is that like a bottle cap or something?" And I was like, I don't know, maybe. And a few people sort of thought of it back at that time. Someone said, "Is that like pop a cap in your ass? Is that like some sort of gangster thing?" It had the advantage of being short and easy to spell. And and then it kind of it grew on people. It had a sort of a nice, friendly sound to it.
So what was the plan for the company then? Like, what was the team's goal? Did you have pillars of any sort or like a plan?
No, it was like Jason would always be like, make great games. That's all we have to do is just make great games. There was like games for kids like Nintendo, and there was hardcore games, and there was no in between except for like a weird exception. So I think our whole thing at the beginning was make games that we find fun, that are good games, and then make that fun accessible and open to anyone.
There were other Match 3 games before Bejeweled, but the truth is we didn't know about any of them really at the time. I think that probably some people have figured out that maybe the earliest version of that was some Russian game called Shiriki.
Yeah.
That was around in I think maybe late 70s or something. We certainly weren't aware of that one. What we were aware of was, I think John had found this really primitive web game. I don't think it even had a name. I think it was just colorsgame.com. I've tried to find it again, but I have not had any luck finding it anywhere on any Wayback Machines or anything like that. It was extremely crude. It was a Match 3, but it didn't have any animations or sound. It was just these square blocks that you swapped and they disappeared. It was extremely crude, but I thought, hey, this is an interesting mechanic. We could probably make kind of a web game, like with this mechanic. And so I said, let's try something. And so Brian went off to program a JavaScript engine that was a little bit more sophisticated. And I went off to try and figure out some better graphics. And again, it was one of those stories where it was actually a pretty quick series of decisions. The first thought was, well, squares are boring. If you're going to be matching these different, colored things, it'd be good if they had different shapes. So they're basically geometric shapes of different colors that were converted into gemstones at the last second to give them at least some sort of marginal basis in reality.
Yeah. It is so wild to me that whoever uploaded this simple online game, the Colors game or whatever it was called, never tried to reach out. Like, do you think it was just a weird project probably derived from Shiriki, the old Russian game, and they just threw it up and then never double checked it again?
Yeah, I assume so. I mean, I'd be curious to hear from whoever actually made it. Again, it was really basic. It was this sort of thing. It was like the equivalent of, it wasn't even Flash, but it'd be equivalent of one of these disposable Flash games that someone programmed and threw up in a night. So it was, I mean, I have no idea if that person, is even aware knows of anything like this.
Has your thinking evolved throughout the years on just the start of PopCap in that way? Do you think like, oh, is that kind of weird that we just took that design versus like, well, we iterated on it in so many smart ways that I don't have any mixed feelings about the origins here?
Well, I mean, I guess it gets into some of those ideas of cloning versus inspiration and so forth. I don't know. I mean, we've been, PopCap games have been cloned various times, of course, and again, we've certainly borrowed ideas from other places for things. I kind of, eventually, I guess I came to feel that that's the sort of the natural way that games evolve. And as long as I feel okay about it, whether it's our game or someone else doing something with one of our games, as long as they're adding something new or trying something different. So things like, originally games like, like Puzzle Quest, for example, I thought was really cool because it really, obviously you used some of the ideas from Bejeweled, but then added that whole RPG aspect to it that was, not something we'd ever done. So I was kind of wish I thought of that, but certainly wasn't mad about them using that. I think the only ones that were really annoying were ones where it's like just a complete rip off, like basically changing only enough to avoid copyright, issues, like just changing a couple of graphics and not changing anything else.
Were you frustrated by the feedback that you got from Bejeweled early on? Was a lot of people telling you this isn't even a game? What the hell are you doing?
Oh yeah, I mean that was the weirdest thing is you'd show people and they'd because it was a web game, so you could send in a web page, and that was brand new, right? There wasn't a lot of certainly very few good web games, and even Flash at the time wasn't really that popular. So it was in Java, and it was pretty new to be able to play a game at all on your web browser. But you could send it to people like, here's a link here's a link, click on it, and they could play. And I think it was key because it let people try it that normally wouldn't try a game, because before you'd have to go out and buy it. You spend $20 or $30 to buy a game. So if you didn't think you like games, there's no way you're going to spend $30 on a game. It's nonsensical, right? And so because we could send in a web page, we could get people to try it, and they'd respond back like, "Yeah, it's just weird. It's like not even a game." But it's like I did it for a while. They're like, "Well, how long did you play?" Like 3 hours. And you'd be like, and then we'd be like, "Well, that sounds like a game to me." Right? And then people would and so we ended up putting in time to mode. And then what would happen is people would play, and then they'd say, "Oh yeah, well, I tried time mode and it wasn't as fun, so I went back to the normal mode." And then they wouldn't comment because it had time mode where you could lose it faster, less randomly. Somehow that satiated their need for it to be a game.
Was it like, did you guys have discussions internally about, look at how many copies Tetris sold on Game Boy? There is this audience out there. Were there kind of ancestors to Bejeweled early on that you were looking at as even a business model?
No, we were just focused on making a fun game. So we're not tech startup people then. I still find the tech startup world intolerable. So the idea of trying to find a market even, like we wanted a business model. And we created multiple business models, and we're on the edge of many business models through PopCap, but it was always just about making games that everyone could find fun.
The story for Bejeweled was that we came to, we initially talked to Microsoft and they licensed it because they didn't want to spend enough money to actually buy it. So I think we'd asked for like $25,000.
Oh my God.
They said no, but they would pay us like $2,000 a month to license it. So that was so basically we had a couple of games like Bejeweled and a few other ones that we were licensing to Microsoft and a few other places for between $1,000 to $2,000 a month. And so we thought, that's not so bad. If we can, if we get a half dozen or a dozen games at $1,000 a month and 3 or 4 different portals, that adds up. That would be, that could support us. So that was our plan. But then that started falling apart because because the ad market was collapsing. Microsoft came back and was like, "Yeah, I don't know. I don't think we can pay you $2,000 a month for this Bejeweled game anymore." And so we're like, "Oh, okay." And so we were starting to see the writing on the wall that a lot of the portals were not really keen on spending any money on games at all. So that was kind of a bad sign. So at that point, we were trying to think what we could do. And actually, a guy we knew, Howard Tomlinson, who was a developer in the UK who did like Palm Pilot games, and he was sort of familiar with the shareware scene. And he suggested that we should do a shareware version, that we should basically, make a shareware version of some of the games and then try to get people to pay money for them. And that was an interesting idea. We hadn't really thought about that. Shareware at the time was, people were familiar with things like Doom, Duke Nukem, and a couple of games like that. But the way that you got that was typically you might download a demo of the thing from a bulletin board, and then you'd send like a check for $20 to Texas, and then a month later you get some floppy disks in the mail. So at that time, like 2000 era, it was just beginning to be possible to kind of do downloadable games over the internet. You could download this game, install it, and then there were some mechanisms by which you could enter your credit card and unlock a game. So that was kind of what we did with Bejeweled and Bejeweled Deluxe. You download it, you install it, you were given like 50 free plays, and then you had to pay $20. We basically struck a deal with some of these partners to tell them that, well, okay, you can host a web game of Bejeweled or whatever, and we don't really care. Don't don't give us any money for it at all. Just let us advertise this downloadable version, and it'll be fine.
Eventually, we realized we had these games that were the most popular games on the internet. Where you're getting like over 1 million daily players on Bejeweled.
It was kind of a big funnel, so you had hundreds of thousands of people playing on the web, and then some of those guys would download the trial version on the download, and some of those people would actually pay money for it.
Brian made this little program that whenever we had a sale, it would go ka-ching. And it was pretty cool, right? You'd be working at ka-ching, and you're like, oh, $20, right? And it was doing way better than we thought after the first week. And we're like, whoa, like there might be a real thing here. Like we were making $12,000 a month from licensing revenue, and maybe like $500 to $1,000 a month from advertising ourselves. So like we didn't, like that wasn't enough for us to pay rent, but that's about it.
Sure.
We released the downloadable version, the deluxe versions, and I think we were on track to make $30,000 from that in the first month. And so it was like really pretty big, but this was in the first week, and myself, Brian, and a couple other people were at my place, and we're watching the movie Clerks. And there's a line in Clerks where they're like, you can't just sit on your couch and make money. And then all of a sudden my speakers, for some reason, were turned up really high. It goes ka-ching! And the whole like room shakes with a ka-ching. And then it was pretty amazing moment because I guess that's what we were doing. That's what it felt like we were doing, was just sitting on our couch making money.
That's ridiculous. And then that was just the next era of your life was Bejeweled will just constantly make money, and now we can actually build up something that we're proud of in a larger effort here, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that like Jason is always very conservative. He's always afraid that the whole world is going to collapse. And so I think there's two types of people who grow up poor. They're the people who grow up poor who are highly aware of money and are constantly afraid of it going away. And there are people who grow up poor who have no concept of money and don't intend to, right? And so I would say Jason was one extreme. And then I was on the other extreme. I'm like, well, this is what's happening today, so let's be cool. But we did decide, like, we hired one person to do art full time that we were contracting with, this guy Josh Langley, and then but we didn't try to grow. We didn't know, we were like, this could go away any day now. We just didn't know.
I heard something, or I believe it was in one of your talks, where you're talking about how there were still browser-based versions of Bejeweled, even after you were selling Bejeweled Deluxe. Like there was still some remnant that Microsoft owned and like slapped different brands on it. Do you want to tell the story of how that happened?
Yeah. I think the agreement we have with Microsoft, I think, was such that, well, it's a long story, but originally the name for Bejeweled was originally called Diamond Mine. And when we had it up on a couple websites, but when Microsoft licensed it, they wanted to change the name to make sure that it was unique to their website. And so the name that they wanted was Bejeweled, which I actually really hated because I hated it because it was basically timed with that Brendan Fraser movie Bedazzled. And so it sounded like a really dumb topical reference that was going to be, super outdated in about 2 months. So I just thought it was a terrible, terrible name. But they used that on their site. And of course, over time, it became clear that Bejeweled was actually a much better name than Diamond Mine. And so eventually we decided that we had to unify the names and say, okay, well, let's just start calling it Bejeweled everywhere. And so the deal we struck with Microsoft on that was that they would let us use the name Bejeweled again for everything, in return for which we had to do basically had to do some branded versions of the game for them, which meant there were a couple of very embarrassing branded versions of Bejeweled. I think there was like Smirnoff Ice Bejeweled and a couple other really, I think probably the most embarrassing one was Tyson Chicken Bejeweled, which was, it was bejeweled with chicken parts.
Oh my God.
So, And then I think the pork board. There was also a pork board Bejeweled, which was again paid for by the pork board of, I guess, pork producers. And that one was so bad I was actually almost in favor of it, but I wanted to have it be either called Be Porked or Pork Jeweled. And unfortunately, they did not let us do either of those things.
Our second game was this game called Alchemy. And Alchemy is just a fond place in my heart. It was just a puzzle game, and I really enjoyed it. And then from Alchemy, we made a couple ones. This game, Seven Seas, Mummy Maze, weren't as kind of accessible. And Mummy Maze was pretty puzzly. It was based off of a game that someone had developed, made a maze algorithm for Theseus and the Minotaur. And then the next kind of hit game that PopCap had, Alchemy always did well, but it was not in the same tier. The next one was Zuma. A few years after that.
And do you remember where that game came from?
Yeah, there was this game called Puzzloop, which was this Japanese game, and we didn't even think the company was like around at all. And so we're like, well, they had some game design issues in Puzzloop for sure. Like things that like it was just kind of one track, and it got frustrating towards the end of every round. They didn't have extra like there's things that like I feel like we added a lot to it. Like we made different courses. We had the mechanic where you push the balls back. Things that make Zuma very Zuma were all things that we kind of added to that core mechanic. But Puzzloop was there, and eventually they were like, we got some like years later. There was a lot of frustration, and I felt kind of bad about that because we thought they were defunct because the only way you could find it was on like emulator things.
Was that part of the strategy at that point? Like after Bejeweled blew up in such a huge way, and it kind of came from the Colors game, like this little browser game that disappeared. Was that a discussion about like, let's look around for other just core ideas, then iterate on some ideas that are floating out there but haven't hit big yet?
Yeah, so I don't think it was like, I think it was like look for inspiration in things that are out there that aren't accessible, right? Like things that like we look for nuggets and like, is there a nugget there, right? So all of our games was based on a nugget of something else.
So Microsoft had the option of buying Bejeweled early on then for how much was it?
I think we asked for $25,000 or something.
Do you have any sense now of the total amount of money that Bejeweled has made with all its iterations?
Gosh, no, I've more than that. But I do know that Microsoft actually, they had the option to buy PopCap as well. And then I think around 2003 or 4, we had some discussions with them about selling the company. But I still remember those discussions because we didn't really know anything about business or anything at the time. But we were in a room with these Microsoft guys, and they had these financial people who showed us all these PowerPoints about all these different things. And at the end of the PowerPoint, they basically were saying, it's like, so here's the deal, we'll offer you this, and you'll also get, the special blue badge that will let you, I guess, go into the Microsoft cafeterias or whatever. That the full-time, I guess it was a valued thing to be a full-time blue badge holder or whatever. And we'll pay you $5 million. And our response, I was going to say, well, okay, but I mean, we've got $3 million in the bank right now, and we're making money. I'm not sure. I just make the jewels go clink. So I don't really understand all of the stuff that you're saying, but this doesn't sound like a great deal for us. And so we turned that one down. Once every couple of years, we had a couple of serious discussions about selling the company. And they all kind of fell apart for one reason or another until 2011, of course.
Yeah. Did it fall apart because you were feeling that you wanted to stay independent pretty strongly, or was it just the numbers were always just not making sense?
It's usually a combination of those things. I mean, if it got to the point where there's this, someone's, a large company, was said, well, we've got it'll be great. It'll be a lot of money, and we'll give you all the creative control and blah, blah, blah. And we'd say, well, I guess it can't hurt to listen to their pitch. Although sometimes what we found actually did happen, and it's kind of a warning I tell people who might be in a similar position, is it seems like it doesn't hurt, but then you spend a couple months and then you go and due diligence and you spend a lot of time kind of running around talking about things. And then in specifically, there's one case, we thought we had a really great deal all set up, and it was looked really good. It's like, wow, this is going to be, great. And then one day, this guy flies in from New York, the closer, some guy whose last job was negotiating Steven Spielberg's salary. And he flies in and basically, says like, that deal they were talking about, that deal's off the table, but here's the new deal. And, kind of just proceeds to completely offer this totally new, totally terrible deal. And, and again, we were like, wow, geez, that's terrible. But we've just wasted 3 months, doing all this stuff. And luckily in our case, because, PopCap had always been profitable, we, basically were able to walk away from that. But if you've been a typical startup where you're burning money and, you have a limited amount of time left before you might actually run out of cash, you spend 3 or 6 months fooling around with some guys who seem really, like it's a great deal. And then one day suddenly the deal is much worse. I can see how that's the pressure there is. It's like, well, we've already gone this far. And if we don't take this deal, we got to start from scratch and we're going to run out of money in 2 months. You can see how they would do something they didn't really want to.
We were just making real money. Like we weren't many people were making, I think almost $1 million a year.
Jesus.
So PopCap always grew behind revenue. We never tried to accelerate the growth to growth. Leading from growth wasn't ever our goal. It was always like, how are we doing next year? And what do we think the next couple of years is going to look like? And what's the right kind of business size for that? So we were always on the conservative side. And pretty much the whole time until after we got bought by EA, where we kind of went into this go big mentality. And so that I think was a big key to us, right? Because that's what gave us creative freedom. That's what gave us the safety to cancel games, right? We weren't pushing the edge of growth. We weren't trying to be this big company. We were just trying to make good games and get them to people. And we adapted a lot. We did a lot of licensing. So I think the other key that we had at PopCap is we'd focus on the core. And then we would license with partners, like the mobile version or the Palm Pilot version or whatever. And so we'd get that out there for other people to do all kind of the work and absorb the cost. And then we would take a small royalty or sometimes a good size royalty. And that was really, I think, a big thing because that gave us a lot of promotion, a lot of market awareness. We weren't absorbing the cost and we weren't having to grow and do those ourselves. And so that really helped because a large percentage of our business at PopCap was always pretty high margin and controllable, even if the core development, we wouldn't pay attention. We got Dave Roberts was our CEO. He joined us in 2003 or 4 or something like that. He eventually started to kind of bring in the capabilities for us to sort of manage that more ourselves in that same spirit. So we would bring on a development in-house to do versions for the Xbox or mobile phones eventually. But it was always we treat it differently. And then our core business, it would be we wouldn't track it like a normal business. It wouldn't be relevant, right? So the thing that Dave would always say, and he was the MBA business guy coming on to us, and he was amazing because he didn't try to control the studio, right? He was just okay, that's just what it is. But then people would ask us many years well, how much does it cost to make a game? How much did it cost to develop Plants vs. Zombies? We don't know. What do you mean you don't know? We don't know. We don't track it. It's not a relevant thing for us. And the thing that Dave came up with that I thought was good, though I think we think it's better than most other people think it is, but I think it's really relevant, is, well, tell me how much does it cost to write a great novel?
Right.
So how much do I have to pay to get a great novel? How much does it cost? It's a dumb question. There is almost no correlation between the cost of a novel and the quality of the novel, right? They're not directly related. You can't manage the publishing industry like that.
And the idea was Bejeweled was just so consistent and growing that it was just all right, we're printing money and now we have time to be experimental and weird.
Yeah, that was the strategy, such as it was to rely on if you had rely on a hit game. Initially it was Bejeweled, and later on it was stuff like Zuma and Peggle, and then Plants vs. Zombies. You rely on the hit game to kind of make money to fund the next sort of batch of experiments and hope that some of those worked out. We were in a really interesting emerging space where you do a lot of crazy stuff and still succeed because there wasn't that much kind of pressure or competition.
Yeah, there was this moment where it still hits me where we had started PopCap. We were having success financially. We hadn't grown, and so Brian Feet and I went to Argentina to live for a while. He stayed for 2 months and I stayed for 4 months, and we were just working, right? We were just doing we were trying to learn Spanish and just working on PopCap, right? Poor Jason was freaked out because he thought we were just going to disappear. And Jason thinks every place that's not Canada is like really unsafe. He doesn't think that, but it's a joke I would make as if he thought that, and then people would believe it. That's the problem with starting a company with 3 people and doing it for so long too. You have a sibling relationship it's not always as kind as you want it to be because you have so much love in between. Anyways, I just got back and I was applying for apartments, and my credit was very bad. But before you could do the tour of this one place, you had to apply. And so we did that, and we went and we toured the place, and then we got down. Everyone who worked there was like, "Oh my God, you guys made Bejeweled. You're a PopCap. We played that game." And it was like 8 people were like huddled around us being like, "Oh man, here's how we play." And it was like this moment where like, it's gone so far beyond us.
A lot of the PopCap alumni of PopCap kind of in retrospect, I think of those years of like the 2000 to 2008 kind of era as sort of the golden years. And in truth, a lot of the people then didn't really, including us, didn't really know any better because most of them didn't come from the video game industry at all. So because there was no casual game industry. So, when you hired people, most of the time they weren't usually from other game companies. They were kind of, wherever, young artists or programmers who hadn't necessarily worked at Electronic Arts or any other kind of large company. And again, at the time in the early 2000s, there wasn't really a big indie scene. That was sort of still before things like Steam and the App Store had made it really easy to do that. In 2000, it wasn't impossible to do an indie game, but it was very difficult to get it published anywhere that anyone might actually see or buy it. So we had a lot of people who were just coming in from, random unrelated fields, comic book artists, this and that. So for a lot of those people, PopCap was their first video game job, and they weren't necessarily sure what to expect.
My name's Matt Johnston, and I was first hired into the PopCap Game Studio around like employee number 40 as a game producer. My first day was pretty great. So like I was being toured around the office, and the first place they showed me is just because of the proximity to the place where I started. It was the break room. My first experience was this employee coming in, and like I'm standing in there, and there's a sink, and there's like some snacks and all this typical game studio break room, and he just says excuse me very nicely, and then opens this cabinet above the sink and pulls a full handle of vodka out of the cabinet and just makes like the biggest screwdriver I've ever seen, the stiffest screwdriver I've ever seen, and it's like not even lunchtime. So that was my first experience, and then just like bam, bam, like right, left hook. The next thing that happened was this person who I hadn't met yet, but became a great friend, obviously, Ben Lyon. He comes in, and he was a producer on Zuma. Like he was the man behind Zuma and Zuma's Revenge. He comes in, and he's just like, do not eat these donuts. These donuts are poisonous. There's something wrong with these donuts. He's holding half a donut in his mouth, the bite taken out of it. He's like, my mouth is on fire. There's something wrong with donuts. And everyone's like, oh my God, like what's happening? What's the problem? And he's just like, I don't know, but like, and they were from this place around the corner. I won't name them either. But like he was literally on fire. So it sort of was concluded like that he needed to take the box of donuts down to the place and like see what's up, like raise hell, right? So he takes the box of donuts and he splits out of the office. And then right around the corner comes Walter Wilson, who we recently just lost, unfortunately. But he comes around the corner and he's just like, oh, where'd the donuts go? And we're like, well, there's something wrong with them. Like, I hope you didn't have it. And he's like, no, but I did put this Chinese mustard in a couple of them. He was just like, do you think it was mean for me to let him go down to the donut shop with the full box? Like there was this whole moral kind of conundrum conversation. Meanwhile, Ben is down there like completely, ripping everybody a new one.
Oh no.
Yeah. So those were my first moments at PopCap. I gotta say, I mean, the culture and the vibe in that studio was unchanged, like pretty much the entire time that I worked.
My name's Anthony Coleman. I started at PopCap in like 2005.
Well, that first day, what was your first impression of the office? Walking through the doors, what hit you first?
Pretty small. I remember getting back, visiting the first time, like before my first day, just having lunch and getting introduced. And it was like a quarter of a floor in an office space in downtown Seattle. It was bright. Everyone was really overall friendly, and like didn't feel like a place where there was like people were siloed off into their own places and stuff. Yeah, there was some offices around the outside, but usually all the doors are just open, and then you could just see people walking back and forth or sliding their chairs over, talking to other people, checking out like the latest game prototype someone had made, like looking over their shoulder and like talking about it. And just there really was from the start just this sense of crazy like collaboration between all disciplines and departments, and just general openness in that way of being like, hey, we're not trying to hide anything we're doing from anyone at the company. It's just, this is what we're doing. And it kind of even filtered into internal tools that we were using and the company had made. Early company, especially in that, it was just a very playful, like, we're going to talk about random stuff. We're going to talk about the games we play and love and how that influences what we're making, even when it's Bejeweled or things like that, where you like people like, oh, that's just a casual game. It's like, no, it was, but it wasn't like that was being made by people who only played match 3 games. I got there. We also were working on the first iteration of Bookworm Adventures, which is where I spent a lot of my time in that game, sequels and just the Bookworm franchise. And it is a pretty straightforward RPG. Like, you're spelling words to fight monsters, but you level up, you get experience, you have treasures and equipment, and like, it's an RPG under all this layer of spelling words and being silly.
My name is Ellen Marett. I started at PopCap in 2005 and was there for a little over 8 years. When I started PopCap, it was about 40 people. I was the third woman hired at PopCap, but it was a pretty small company. Again, it was about 40 people. And so we just walked around, like they did a tour and introduced me to everybody. And, they gave me my own office, partially because I am loud. Like, there literally wasn't a day that went by that I didn't guffaw at something.
How would you describe the office culture? What was it like? It was interesting. I hadn't again ever worked in the video game industry, and it was interesting. There was definitely super smart, really nice people. But I feel like I became responsible for the culture. And so I definitely knew there were some changes. So by the time I left PopCap, I was the, I forget what my senior director of workforce culture and environment. So by the time I left PopCap, I was responsible for the culture. And so I could see that there were some rooms, there was some room for improvement in some areas.
Even as we grew into a much bigger size, it felt very much like a family in a lot of ways. Like, this is family and friends you're working with, not just random people.
I think that the reason why that group of people was able to make those experiences was because of the culture that they protected really fiercely within that company, which was, it's got to be fun. It's got to be enjoyable. And if we're not enjoying the practice of making the game, then the game itself will not be enjoyable either. in a culture that was like, really focused on fun and really focused on making everybody like have a good time making the games, because we felt like that would work its way into the game. There was also time for like, stop shooting those Nerf guns like around me while I'm trying to work. Like, there was like a line that you could cross where it was unacceptable and it was disruptive and it was like not helping. So it wasn't like just all the time super fun. I think that there was a special chemistry and a methodology that was developed amongst a core group of people that was really hard to actually like carry forward as the company got larger.
PopCap, I don't think we were successful because we were individual powerhouses. I think we were successful because we had a lot of people working together to do a lot of different things, and they did a really good job doing that, right? Like, I think Dave Roberts, who was our CEO, like, he minimized bureaucracy in the company and he never let the wrong thing start driving. And then Dennis, who was like the business guy suit that people were afraid of when he first started, he as well, he always just said, we're going to manage this business as best we can, and we have a publishing team, but our job is not to manage the business by trying to manage the studio. We'll get what we get from the studio, and that's as it should be. Our job is to do what we can with that, whatever that is, right? And that philosophy was not common. So he gets a lot of credit for that. And then the customer support team, who did amazing customer support through the years at PopCap. And anyone I know who had a problem with the PopCap game, they were able to like write in and get real help from real people who didn't just get ground to the ticket shreds, right? Like to the account, like the PopCap story is one where it's like everyone was there to make games and everyone was doing it wherever they were. And that we were able to do these things together and get bigger in scale was like, that's the story that I think gets missed. It's so easy to talk about the founders and what we did. And, we did some good things and we did some great things. And certainly we created it. And, like Jason and Brian's individual game design power was so phenomenal that you can't not take that into account in my mind. But that wasn't what brought the magic. What brought magic was like everyone doing what they could just to make great games. So that's probably the thing that gets missed.
I am Garth Chouteau. I am a longtime PR practitioner entirely in the high-tech vein, most of it in video games, dating all the way back to 1986. I would do a press tour every year with either Dave Roberts and Jason Kapalka or Dave Roberts and John Vechey. And so that was kind of the beginning of it. And, we didn't really have budget, but we didn't need it. We're telling stories around really kind of fun, very broadly appealing games that, were just starting to be known as casual games. And we kind of debated whether that was a good label. And I said, it's kind of already out there. I don't think we want to fight this, but maybe we can reinvent casual games and kind of get people to discover that they are more than Snake and Minesweeper or something. One of our customer service people said, hey, this group of, it's like the Sisters of Notre Dame retired nuns organization is asking if we can provide a discount on some of our games because they like to send them out to their various chapters around the country because these retired nuns love playing our games. But they can't afford it. And I called them up directly and I said, you can have all the games you want for free. I just want the details. And I was like, geez, this is one of 12 chapters that they have. This is the one in Mississippi. But it sounds like fucking Cocoon down there. I mean, they are claiming that these games are keeping them young. So I get Seth Giselle from the New York Times on the phone and say, Seth, this is going to sound a little crazy, but there are these nuns down in Mississippi. They're staying young, playing Bookworm. So that was a huge story. It was like front page of the second section, like the arts and leisure section of the New York Times. One of the things we always wanted was we wanted to get in the women's magazines because we knew that the vast majority of Bejeweled players were women. We sent jewel-encrusted phones, mobile phones, to dozens and dozens of the top editors at Marie Claire and Woman's World, Working Woman, all the leading women's magazines of 2006, 7, 8. Rarely got any response. Occasionally I'd get a response that was, oh, that thing that you sent me covered in gems was so nice. Thank you so much. but they just, as soon as we would include them on the press tours. And the minute we sat down and started talking video games, their eyes just glazed over. They didn't want to hear about it. They didn't want to think about assigning it to somebody, having to edit it, whatever.
Right.
So it took a couple years to really get there. But eventually we got enough human interest stories. I wrote, I think it was 150 individual profiles of people, parents, kids, elderly people, disabled people, etc. I don't know if you can read it, but somewhere here it says video games cured her son's autism.
All right. Okay, magazines. When you saw that headline, did you wince a little bit? Like, okay, let's take it down a notch, everybody. These games are fun, but...
No, because that part maybe a little bit.
Sure.
But autism breakthrough, video games gave my son a better life.
Okay.
All right.
Not bad. All right.
All About Insaniquarium, one of our kind of secondary titles.
Right.
So it was a nice big hit for that. And it was kind of the icebreaker. After that, it just seemed to kind of flow. We got coverage in every woman's magazine, I think, over the next year or two after that. There was a story about a guy, I can't remember where some of these came from, but we just did such a good job of turning them into PR and stories that people wanted to hear. It was a guy who was getting married, who wanted to propose to his girlfriend. She was a huge Bejeweled fan. There was no Bejeweled port or adaptation for Game Boy. So he hacked it somehow. He was a programmer, and he hacked it onto her Game Boy and arranged for, after a certain minimal number of points were scored, the screen to kind of clear and this diamond ring to drop down. And he kind of was hovering behind her while she was playing, waiting for her to see this and be surprised. And he proposed and she said yes. And somehow we got wind of this and we said, well, we want to sponsor the wedding or at least the reception. So we paid for a Bejeweled wedding cake, Bejeweled decorations at the wedding and the reception, a copy of Bejeweled Deluxe or something for everybody attending, the 200 people who came to the wedding, that sort of thing, and turned that into major press in mostly regional, but it did get some national and even global pickup because it was just kind of a weird, human interest story. We really got out in front of the casual games thing. We're champions of that category in a way that made us the de facto source for data, for customer references. When ABC World News Tonight wanted to do a big segment on casual games, we probably got half of that segment or more.
Of course. That
kind of thing. So I've been a big believer in leveraging your customers, knowing who they are, how they think, putting yourself in their shoes for a long, long time. And at PopCap, it paid off in spades. Surreal moments would be like coming out of the office in Seattle to go to lunch and finding fans parked out in front, offering you money for your PopCap sweatshirt. That kind of thing. Okay. Yeah. That's when you knew, holy smoke, we've hit the big time.
PopCap was pretty good about just like giving you the rope to hang yourself with. And then you go and do it. And if you live to fight another day, then you'll get an even better challenge and you're rewarded with more challenging opportunities. So that was great. And then as the secondary challenge and thing that made it difficult was just dealing with the growth. Mm-hmm. It's like you have a personal challenge of this, like having to adapt to a new environment and new people and growth and things that, you get comfortable with. And then it's like, okay, now you're uncomfortable and you have to adapt. It's not like the company's going to adapt for you. So as the company changed, and it changed like 3 times pretty significantly. And we were all adapting with it. And I was like on the beginning of the second wave of hiring. So like there were a whole group of people that were basically founders and started the company. And, they had it way worse than me when it came to like adapting to the new way of doing things or all these new people or, just like standards that like just the highest standards that I've ever seen in any game studio in terms of just like expectations of others expectations for yourself, like what you're expected to do. There's a lot of pressure put on yourself to like be the best that you can be, to make the best game that you can. And everybody's playing the games in real time, all the time, and giving you feedback all the time, just ripping your game a new one. So it was a high intensity environment. And to see, I think for those people to know that worked, and to have been able to see how the success that brought, and then to see maybe it getting watered down over time would have probably been a heartbreaker, you know?
It was a boiling water thing. I mean, Jason definitely felt way more and more creative pressure that like, we got to make a hit game. We got to keep on Bejeweled. If they're like he felt a lot of pressure. And I didn't think it helped. It didn't make it more fun, right? Like, you can't, in the same way that like, how do how much does it cost to write a great novel? You can't just sit someone down like, write a great novel is also equally unactionable. But he was getting to the point where he felt like that was his only choice, right? And so I think that was getting stressful, right? Like if the game studio stopped being able to make great games at a consistent enough basis, and we were really, really secure, right? But it did require some amount of new games and some amount of creativity. I think that definitely got to Jason. Like it didn't make it better as we scaled up.
Peggle was early in development when I started there. Like there were some very early prototypes of that. You knew something was a little special about it, because even in this rough state, that's the one people would be like oohing and awing about watching someone playing the prototype.
We were playing a lot of Burnout Revenge. I don't know if you played Burnout series.
I love it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that was happening. And then we were also putting Grand Theft Auto, playing it, and then but then having the audio music be kind of curated by the kind of game designer and producer of Peggle. And the person playing would sort of like try to like kind of coordinate to the music, if you will.
Okay.
Right. And so those two were like some of the big, and then obviously Pachinko were like the biggest influences into Peggle. And so a lot of what we were doing with Peggle was just trying to reinforce that gameplay and just make it like in your face and really reactive to the emotional side of the game. I don't think we said emotional side of the game, but how do you make that like, wow, like that takedown, right? Remember that slow motion, like takedown?
Yeah.
It was amazing, right? It just you felt good no matter what. And then when you did a real good one, you felt even better. But even if you were just like a little takedown, you're like, oh, takedown. And I think that's a lot of Peggle and like Extreme Fever and Ultra Extreme Fever. And even like the zoom in and stuff, all those things were there to give it that sense of like bigness in that moment. And everything around it was meant to kind of reinforce that. It started with an exploration in gameplay. And it was started with like Pachinko-ish inspiration. And then Brian Rothstein, who was a programmer game designer on Peggle, he'd implemented the ball physics and trying to get physics that feel really good. And we went through a bunch of iterations, and a lot of the first ones were a little bit more Pachinko, like you're shooting lots of balls. A lot of the initial ones were like kind of like more like unlocking, like escalating puzzles, real-time action puzzles would be the best way to say it. I don't think there's been a game like it that I can easily point to, but like imagine shooting like a bunch of balls, and then if you get one ball and like a little trigger, then that will trigger something else, and then that then is doing something, and then you have a certain amount of time then to hit the next trigger that unlocks, and it kind of like and it escalates. So you kind of be building up, then you go backwards when you didn't have it, and it was cool on one hand because it was escalating, right? Like you'd be like, and then you could try to win it, and then there were these like, I forget what music was playing, but these gophers would pop up, and like if you ended it, that's what Sukbir did, and it was pretty cool. But it wasn't that much fun in a lot of ways. It wasn't as like replayable. And then from there, we call it like it happened in like 3 days. Brian did the crosses level where you had these like spinning X's, and they were pretty big. And you tried, the goal of the game now was like one ball at a time, and you had to turn them from blue to orange. that got frustrating though, because your last like 5 of the crosses, the spinning X's, it wasn't fun. It was just frustrating. You'd be like ball, shoot, miss, ball, shoot, miss. And so then it moved to they disappeared when you turned them orange. So it was a 1 ball, they disappeared. But then it was like, oh, it got 2. It was the end game got boring. Right. And then there was just like, it was not fun to clear these big chunks. So we made them the smaller the pegs. They cleared, we turned them orange. And then it was like, and then only so many of them were orange at a time. And so like that progression, it went from not Peggle to Peggle very quickly. And after that, everything became how to reinforce the gameplay and how to make it more. It's just everything was about how to make it feel better, right? Like the different power-ups tied to characters feel way cooler in some ways when you hit them and when you use them exploring them than they do just, it was just like a power-up there. If there's, so things like that were the choice. And then like the fighting games, right? There's something about fighting games where, the personality of the fighter you choose, right, is almost in some ways as an important of a choice as what their powers are and how you unlock those powers. And so we wanted to incorporate that element into the game because it just made it more like, oh, what am I going to unlock? Who am I going to unlock now? What powers did they have, right? And then you could kind of tell this very light story in Peggle.
Yeah, I heard that like originally it had like a Norse theme to it. Do you remember this?
Did Jason say that?
I read it online. It's called Thunderball, and there's something about like Thor's goat or something.
Oh yeah. It was the original one was called Thunderball. That's like those iterations I was playing. It was definitely Thunderball. I don't know how Norse themed it was, but it was Thunderball, and we played off that a lot. But it was like the gophers were the ones celebrated. There's nothing Norse about gophers. They might not even have gophers, as far as I know. Peggle was also Peggo.
Huh.
And we couldn't do Peggo because of Lego. And so we changed it to Peggle at like the last minute, and then it's Peggle. It's like, can you imagine it? Peggo?
Sounds gross.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, sounds gross. Like, what's that?
Original developer of Peggle and like the artist came to clashes a few times on, I would say everyone worked their way through it, but definitely like some big disagreements on like the designer program being like, no, it's supposed to be like this. And the artist being like, that is terrible aesthetic choice. Like, why would that exist in this? Why would pizza or something exist here? And it's like this most stupid thing, but it was like a tiny thing. But that's usually what the arguments kind of were on a lot of times. Weren't the grand schemes of the games or anything. It was like the tiny minutia that's like people felt very passionate about.
The first thing that they wanted me to do, or they just very politely asked me to do, was just help with the audio for Peggle, which was in development, and it was already well underway. And, a lot of times audio gets kind of left for last, and PopCap at the time was a very small game studio. And so, they just didn't have any in-house audio expertise. And here suddenly they did, even though I was trying not to be an audio person. They're like, can you just do us this one solid? And, I really wanted to make an impression, and I wanted to prove my value, and I wanted to be useful right out of the gate. So I said yes. And it turns out like my work on Peggle, on the sound for Peggle, which is like helping. The first thing I did was I made like the ball impact sounds hitting the pegs, and we decided to make that sort of an escalating sound. And then I helped Sootbeer, the designer, kind of the genius behind Peggle. I helped him with, getting Ode to Joy right, finding the right version and making sure it was edited correctly and sounded good. And it's funny because I spent the least amount of time on that audio than I had spent on any other project that I had ever worked on, including like big franchises like Flight Simulator and Fable and all kinds of stuff. And that's the Peggle is the most awarded audio that I've ever worked on. And it was like that. It was the thing I didn't want to do, and it was the thing that I spent the least amount of time on.
Peggle was the game that opened the door for us to most of the gaming press. They didn't want to talk to us before that. We had Heavy Weapon, but that was like this side-scrolling arcade thing. We had Insane Aquarium, we had Bookworm, we had Bejeweled, we had Chuzzle. My mom plays these games, Garth. Don't call me again, kind of thing, right? And then we got Peggle. And I started sending that out, and I was getting sort of, the same response. This isn't even a game, Garth. What is this? I'm bored. It's 5 minutes in. I don't get it. It's all luck. And I had to beg these editors and journalists, you've got to give it an hour. I will stake my reputation on this. You can ignore me for the rest of my life, but you must play this for an hour. Trust me, there is skill involved. You have that skill. You can be good at this, and it will be fun. And sure enough, to a person, they all came back and went, thank you. I am so glad you talked me into sticking with this. I cannot stop freaking playing. You've probably heard the story about the guys at Valve calling us going, you have to tell us how to finish this fucking game because Half-Life 2 is now at a standstill. We cannot get it out the door. Everybody on the programming side is now playing Peggle. For God's sake, make it stop.
There was a huge amount of us who played World of Warcraft.
Right.
We had a guild, and weirdly that mixed with Maxis folks at the time.
Oh, fun.
So it was like PopCap cross Maxis does raiding during Burning Crusade and Lich King, which was hilarious. It was one of my favorite times ever playing games online. But that started working where we were like, we're playing WoW a lot. This could be fun. Hey, we found like someone made this Bejeweled mod for WoW. Like you can play Bejeweled while you're waiting in WoW in their UI. Oh, they ripped off our art. Like actually just used our art. We should probably shut that down. And then it's like, how about we don't shut it down? We pay the guy to actually give him real art and make it nice. And we did. And there was I guess it would be considered an official Bejeweled UI mod inside of World of Warcraft, where it had like a blitz mode so you could play it during flight paths, and it would know the time of a flight path, so you could see what high score you would get on the flight path, and it would, if someone else was on that flight path, they could see the high scoreboard.
That's amazing.
We went a little overboard there, and then that led us to being like, if we did Bejeweled in there, could we do Peggle in World of Warcraft? And so we actually just hired that guy. His name was Michael Frumwiller. He was still, I think, in school too. And we're just like, hey, we'll just hire you right now if you feel like you can make Peggle and WoW UI. And he did. I don't think those even function anymore. I mean, they kept them up to date for a while, but I think they're dead at this point. That was random. But then that got into other weird extras because we did a thing with Blizzard where we made a special Peggle version, a Warcraft Peggle thing, like we did with Valve. There was the orange box Peggle,
right,
as well.
Right.
Like that was another odd collaboration, I would say at times. Like honestly, I don't know how some of those just come about. Like we were very respected in what we did at the time. And we also really respected those other companies, and we've just talked to them and be like, hey, you want to do something fun?
We did like Peggle Extreme, which shipped with the orange box at Valve, which was quite a weird thing to do. And we had some discussions about that. That was, again, it was basically this Half-Life themed version of Peggle with like head crabs and all this stuff. And it didn't make any sense really, except that, Valve had sort of, they're fans of Peggle, and they kind of invite us to do this thing with their orange box. And we had some serious debates about like, is this going to be good for us? Is this bad for the PopCap brand? Are people going to like be offended by this stuff? Or will like Steam players think it's just really stupid? But I remember that at some point we were having a discussion, and we said, well, I don't know, who knows if it's a good idea, but sometimes it's not about the money, it's just about whether something is cool. That was interesting, and that was kind of a weird era back then, and that Steam was still kind of finding out what it was, going to be. And the Plants vs. Zombies, that was really the first place it kind of took off, was on Steam. And so, it was interesting to see that hardcore gaming crowd on Steam was actually very much open to these games like Plants vs. Zombies or Peggle, which, nowadays you would look on Steam and there's plenty of these kind of pixel art games and these other sort of simpler games, like, and simple in the sense of something like Stardew Valley, which is not a simple, game, but it's also but it's not like Quake. It's not like this, space dungeon, bloodfest.
Mm-hmm.
So I think at the time, we weren't strictly independent games, but I think we were sort of in the vanguard of PC, independent games, that eventually became this big wave of all the independent games you see now on Steam.
Plants vs. Zombies, right? That was a tower defense game.
Yeah.
It looked nothing at all like tower defense. Every tower defense game that was out there, George Fan, the game designer and creator of Plants vs. Zombies, was getting inspiration from.
Hi, my name is Laura Shigihara. I am a video game developer and composer. I knew George from a while back, around the time that we first started talking. I was actually doing record contract stuff in Japan. And George, I think at the time, was working on Insane Aquarium. And so he was just like, oh, someday I want you to write music for one of my games. And it just didn't line up at that point. But then later, he was working on what ended up becoming Plants vs. Zombies. And he's like, you're going to do the music for this one. So I was like, okay, sure. So I grew up playing a lot of Mega Man and Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy, a lot of those kinds of games. And I really like old school boss themes that are really exciting. And so this was the first game that I got to work on where I sort of had free reign over the style, because most of my other projects, there was quite a heavy style guide. We want you to do something orchestral, that's a military theme and this and but for this project, I was able to just kind of put my own style into it. So I really like playing the game first to get a feel for the gameplay and the levels and the characters. And I remember thinking how do I match all these themes? Because it's obviously, it's occult, kind of undead, zombies and everything, but it's also kind of cute. So I was And then on top of that, it was a really silly, funny game, when you're playing and suddenly a Zamboni comes along and ices your lawn and then a bobsled team comes out. You're just oh, that's so silly. So I tried to think about all those things. And for the kind of undead zombie side, I wrote in a lot of Gothic classical style, a lot of half steps and circles of fifths and minor keys. For the kind of cute theme, I had a lot of really, melodic things up front, a lot of catchy melodies that I'd write. And then for the silly part, I mixed a lot of genres together. So you'll hear a track that will have swing beats and then Gothic classical and then some hip hop kind of thing coming in on top of it. And for some reason, it just ended up working. And it was always fun to get the music in the game and then play it and see if it fit or not. And so when it did fit, it was yes.
It's working. And it's a huge part of that game's success. I mean, those tracks are baked into, at this point, millions and millions of players' heads.
It's crazy to think about. I don't know. It was really fun. I think also I wasn't contracted to do a lyrical song, but that's just something I'd always wanted to do. I know nowadays there's more music that has, a lyrical theme or something. But back then, the only songs that I knew of that, the only video games that had lyrical songs were the Final Fantasy games. And I think Portal had just recently come out. And I'd always wanted to do lyrical music for games. So as it got near the end of development, I was oh man, I'm going to write an ending credits song that has words in it. And I was so excited. I remember to get to do that. And I pulled a theme from Watery Graves, which is the pool level music, that kind of chord progression, and sort of worked with that. And that ended up turning into the theme at the end.
People are PVZ is this huge success. I'm when it first came out, it wasn't. It was good and it was profitable, and it came out on PC. It didn't see its heyday until it came out on iPad. That iPad release and then the release on consoles and iPhone is where PVZ trajectory changed enormously and became this huge property.
God, I'm going to forget what show it was on, but I think it was the Tonight Show. I remember there's a moment where Joel McHale was just talking about how much he loved Plants vs. Zombies. And it's one of those from the outside world of like, oh, that has been taken up another level. Okay, we're at the Tonight Show level for Plants vs. Zombies.
It was better than that because first it was Oliver Platt.
Okay.
The night before, Jimmy Fallon's interviewing Oliver Platt, and Oliver's like, well, what have you been up to lately? She's like, I'm playing this game called Plants vs. Zombies. And Oliver looks at him and goes, so am I. And they chat about it for a minute. That's crazy. And the next night, McHale comes on.
Okay.
And Fallon asks him what he'd been up to. And McHale didn't seem like he'd seen the show the night before. Like, he said it totally honestly out of the blue. He's like, I can't stop playing this stupid game called Plants vs. Zombies. And Fallon's like, you're blowing my mind, man. and then not long after that, Fallon found out that Paul Reiser was a huge fan of Plants vs. Zombies.
Of course.
And so as a gag, the night he had Paul Reiser on as a guest, he had, and I don't remember whether we contributed to this, but I feel like we did in some fashion provide certain of the art assets. He created a version called Plants vs. Risers or something, where Paul Reiser's image replaced all the zombies marching across the lawn. And so they spent like 2 minutes on the show talking about that and laughing about it. But yeah, you cannot buy that kind of stuff.
My favorite memories of Plants vs. Zombies are going to be the time that I spent in our Shanghai office. That game went crazy in Asia. I mean, it went crazy everywhere, but oh my gosh, like they were doing clothing with Plants vs. Zombies characters. They rolled it out at this store and there was like, they sold out within like no time. There was like a line around the block to buy Plants vs. Zombies gear. Like it was just a completely, it was really amazing to see it do what it did in Asia.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think it just caught on so well in Asia?
Well, the characters are fantastic, and so they really Rich, who did a lot of the artwork for Plants vs. Zombies, like he did an incredible job at giving those plants and the zombies such character.
Do you get to have a good moment then with Rich, just where you call him up or when you get back to the office just to be like, just so you know, your characters are taking over Shanghai?
Oh yeah, like I made sure he had versions of everything, like anything that the office was doing over there. We made sure that he had copies of it, I mean, that was incredible. That artwork was just incredible.
One of the better stories, and it has been told, is the story of the naming of Plants vs. Zombies, which I remember getting a long list, 30 names at least, and contributing a few. I can't remember which ones, but there were some really great alternative names, much better than Plants vs. Zombies, which is just sort of boring. It's like, yeah, that's what it is. But so what, you know?
Right.
That's not the best name. But among the other ones that were really good was Your Grass Is Mine, was one of the other names that we really wanted to use, but people thought it was a little too edgy. The best name was Lawn of the Dead. And we reached out to George Romero because he owned the rights to Dawn of the Dead, and we knew we'd get in trouble because he had a reputation for being litigious, and he never even responded. I mean, George Fan recorded like a 5-minute video saying how big a fan he was of Romero's films, how deep an honor it would be. No response. 4 years later, I get a call from someone in George Romero's production company saying he's got, his 7th zombie movie coming out and they'd love to partner with us, do something around Plants vs. Zombies. And first I made her send an email so I could share it, like, so that people would believe this actually happened. Right? It's not just a phone call I made up. She sent an email request and I got to circulate that throughout the company and get people commenting on that. And then I had the distinct pleasure of emailing her back and saying, we came hat in hand to you guys, begging to be allowed to use Lawn of the Dead, and you didn't even respond. So no, I don't think we'll be doing business together.
There was like no expense ever spared for like making the game great. The PVZ took forever. Every single one of those games like took way longer than it would have taken in any other traditional like AAA game studio, right? And the kind of shit that we're seeing now, where games are coming out half finished, and there's this like a year of mea culpa and refunds that happen, like that just never ever happened at PopCap because the game was done a year before it was released.
So yeah, so I mean, Bejeweled paid for Plants vs Zombies, which ultimately took like 3 or 4 years to finish Plants vs Zombies.
Oh wow.
So it wouldn't have, even though it was a small team, it would have been very hard to make that kind of commitment to a small indie game like that if you didn't have that kind of security, having Bejeweled money, coming in.
Okay, I'm still trying to figure out the structure. If you say it's a small team for a team like Plants vs Zombies, but still PopCap was hundreds of employees, right? So was it just a bunch of smaller teams, or structurally, how was it laid out?
Well, it varied, but yeah, usually the core team for a game was often quite small. Like Plants vs Zombies was really like, the core team was like maybe four guys. But what would happen is once the games were kind of completed, then you often had a lot of people involved for doing things like ports to other platforms. And that was sort of one of the big things, is to make sure that, so where Plants vs Zombies, the guys who did that, they did it for PC. And they had no real interest or competency at doing things like mobile or console. So once they were done, the PC version, basically some other people, would take over to do it for console and mobile and whatever other platforms we're doing. So so they kind of spun out, they tried to keep very small kind of core, teams doing things like prototyping and initial game design. But then once you had a successful game, to try to spin it out across as many platforms as possible.
There was a small group of people that was tasked with like seeking out expansion platform opportunities. So I was on that team. I was the first person to be hired onto that team. I was the first person to be hired on that team by the guy who started it. And his name was Ed Allard. His mandate was like, hey, okay, we're going to find better homes for these games. Or not better, but new homes for these games. So that included like backs of airplane seats. That included like crazy plug and play little, things that show up in Target or whatever. They're like, okay, well, now we're going to give you like this big break. You get to work on this crazy new platform with this important partner. And it was Apple, and it was the click wheel iPod.
Yeah.
So now there's no dev kit. There's no emulation really. You kind of had an emulated environment, but it wasn't really official or anything like that. And then you couldn't run the game on the device without having to go to Apple and sit in a locked room with an Apple engineer. And the Apple engineer was the only person that could actually like touch the code.
Oh my God.
So you had to direct and work through this proxy. And he was cool, but it was like, it was the kind of experience that you kind of had to save to the end. So you had to get like all this work done and get it basically 95% there, and then you take it to Apple to finish it for like the last 5% or whatever. And so we made a version of Bejeweled, and we made a version of Peggle, which like the Clickwheel iPod, and I don't want to get too into the weeds on the technical details here, but like it was a fixed point math device. There was no floating point math available. So imagine trying to recreate the physics of a round ball and a round peg and how those things interact using fixed point math. It's just like Dan Benet, who was the engineer. So it was a 3-person team. It was me, Dan Benet, and the previously mentioned Walter Wilson. And we created this version of Peggle. And I still to this day don't understand how Dan made Peggle work on the Clickwheel iPod, but he did. And that was a success, relatively speaking. Now, keep in mind, these games were like not even registering to the people in finance compared to the sales that were happening on the PC side. It was still just a non-entity. And because of our relationship with Apple on these Clickwheel games, suddenly there was a new device, and it was a phone, and it was a touchscreen phone, and there was going to be an app store. And they were like, hey, you've been a great partner. We would love for you to be a part of the App Store launch. And now this little team that started with me making like feature phone versions of Bejeweled is now working on a launch title for a new App Store on the iPhone. Again, no dev kit, very little resources, and we did it in 8 months. We created Bejeweled 2 for the iPhone. It was there on launch day, and suddenly now, my team, the team that I was on, it's not my team, but the team that worked on this thing that I was a part of. And not only that, but Ed's team that was like looking for these new platforms had struck gold. And suddenly everybody was taking it seriously, like the potential and the opportunity to like expand beyond the PC platform, which is really most of what they had done and known, was now a possibility. And this came right at the same time when the writing started to show up on the wall that like the PC business might not be continuing to escalate. So
right.
It was perfect timing. And now suddenly Ed's team is on top of the new revenue potential for the company, and the first new revenue potential for the company in since the beginning of the company. So that was actually pretty surreal. Suddenly being like, suddenly as a new game producer, suddenly being the one of the people that was responsible for such an important product in the company's history.
That's wild. Do you have any good Steve Jobs stories of him not understanding the basics of Bejeweled?
No, we never encountered Mr. Jobs at all. I think, we were almost as insignificant to him as we might have been to, some of the leadership at PopCap.
I remember like a big thing for us was when we got on the original iPod.
Yeah.
So we were one of those first games that came out on the iPod. And when we came into work that next morning, everybody had an iPod on their desk and it had engraved on the back, the logo and stuff. And you'd go into the Apple store and there'd be a big thing of Bejeweled in there. And we just like, oh my gosh, that was when we felt like we'd really hit the big time, right? Like we were just like, all right, we've arrived.
We had this engine that was itself able to be kind of intrinsically pure. And it wasn't like they were artists in that, like, they were thinking about how many people will find this game fun, how good is it, right? They were asking those questions, but they weren't encumbering what was already a challenging creative process with things that didn't help it.
Right.
Like, hey, you've been working, so we had games that we were working on for like 3 years that we canceled.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's like a huge list. There's a gigantic list of prototypes that never got released at PopCap. And every once in a while, there's kind of like, oh yeah, that one. I wonder. We had a couple games that got canceled. I think we had a couple of prototypes that got canceled twice. I think we had one that got canceled 4 times, maybe.
What was that one?
That was When Pigs Fly. It was kind of originally like this game where you shoot a pig out of a cannon and try to make him go as far as you could. And then it got canceled as a PC game, and then I think it got canceled as a mobile game, and then I think it made it out as a Facebook game, like into a soft launch for a month or two before it also got canceled.
Oh wow!
So yeah, maybe one day. It was just one of those things where it was, I don't know, it was kind of fun, but it wasn't quite fun enough. And so I mean, the downside of prototyping new game ideas is that it seems like fun, and it is fun for the first few months, but once you've been working on prototyping one game over and over again for like 6 months, you start going kind of bonkers. So there's sort of prototype fatigue, I think, that we noticed, like somewhere around, it could take a couple months to get to a stage where it's playable, and then you sort of had a golden phase of another couple months where you'd be playing around with ways to get it to really, kind of get locked in. But if you didn't succeed, then you started having a downward spiral of just not knowing what the heck was going on, and in some ways lose perspective and you start going crazy, and that's the point where you generally had to kill it.
Yeah, I read somewhere that there were multiple attempts at an RPG called PopQuest. Do you remember what was PopQuest?
PopQuest was it's kind of like a roguelike, basically. It was like a roguelike dungeon crawler, except with kind of very cute cartoony characters that you'd move around. But it was full on tactical RPG. You'd have little guys moving around, kind of XCOM style, combat in these little dungeons. Yeah, I mean, it was actually pretty fun. It had its big problem was it kept scaling up in complexity and kind of adding more features and more things that kind of just sort of ending up turning into this sort of never-ending bug catastrophe. where you change one thing, break 25 others, and then you spend a week fixing that.
It came close. It got to beta, and the beta testers still asked years later, like, what happened to PopQuest? Which was a turn-based kind of tactical RPG. Think very inspired by NetHack in a lot of ways.
Oh, interesting.
It just in a very we had sprites and everything, but you were moving in room-based tile formations, and your heroes had abilities and the whole thing. Like, even internally, we really enjoyed it, but I think it got killed shortly after I started, where they're just like, nah, we can't put this out right now.
Yeah.
And so it just kind of fell away, unfortunately. But the dream lived on for a long time.
Yeah, that was a fun one. I don't know. If I look back at it now, again, that was like more than a decade ago. And of course, there's been a bazillion, on Steam, for example, there's been a zillion indie roguelike RPGs. I was a big fan of roguelikes from back in the day. So, it seemed like a novel idea then. I'm not sure if it would be all that novel now, given the preponderance of roguelikes.
Right. There was a tease of a game that PopCap was working on years and years ago, and it's never left my brain. What was Yeti Train? It's a very good name.
Yeah. Yeti Train was that was one of the games that the Plants vs. Zombies team was working on, post Plants vs. Zombies, and that one actually got pretty far along. Like, it wasn't quite 100% polished in terms of all the graphics and stuff, but it was pretty mechanically solid. And that was what happened there. That was basically a game where you were trying to build railroads across this landscape for this train, which was being driven by a Yeti to transport snowballs or something, I think. And so as you traveled across, it was sort of a 2D side scroller kind of thing of this train. As you traveled across landscapes, you'd be picking up resources and being attacked by pterodactyls that you would shoot snowballs at. And then in each town, there was some sort of resource management stuff where you could buy and sell stuff and improve the town and so forth. It was actually fairly fun. I think that what was the problem with that one? I think that one eventually, I think the problem they had on that was, it was a weird one. I think basically they started second guessing some aspect of it. I think they started second guessing the combat. And they started trying a whole bunch of different variants. Like, the original combat was pretty straightforward. You just kind of clicked on the screen and threw snowballs at pterodactyls, a little bit sort of like a Missile Command-ish kind of deal. At some point, they somewhere along the line, they decided to start trying some other version of combat, and then it kind of just, they just sort of weren't able to find something that satisfied them, and it kind of just sort of got sort of mired in that until it kind of collapsed.
Yeah, Yeti Train was awesome. Like, anything that George Vann did was always great. And PopQuest was pretty good too. It's funny because there's a lot of stuff that was on the cutting room floor. And the fact that stuff didn't get released, I think, is like a testament to just how great that company was. It was like any lesser company would have put that stuff out. I mean, what was it called? There was a space game that was actually like a ripoff of an earlier space game. Like, it was basically like a space battle game where you had like these little tiny asteroids kind of ships, and you're flying around, and there's like some gravity, and you're shooting each other. That game was super fun and totally awesome. We played a lot of it, but it never made it out.
A couple years in, there was some prototypes for like an Xbox Live Arcade platformer.
Oh, interesting.
We got pretty far on that, like trying when Xbox Live was really blowing up, and that was like a really great place for like small indie games. And like, we had ported Bejeweled and Zuma, Astropop, like a number of our core games on there, and they were doing really well. We're like, well, what if we do just a game for Xbox Live, like focus it there first? A couple of the guys there were really into like platformers, and so they worked pretty hard for a while on like making this like platformer prototype-y demo thing.
Do you remember what it looked like or what the name was or anything like that?
I don't remember the name. I don't know if it ever had a final name, or it didn't have any kind of final. It was just whatever they had called it. It had like a robot pirate theme going on.
Okay.
With like getting bunches of treasures and loot. It was pretty combat heavy.
There was this game, it was in the later years, so under EA, probably my last year, and we had this Pop Labs, this prototype kind of group that was doing prototypes, and we gave them a lot of kind of creative control. We tried to kind of, within EA and within the freemium mobile gaming world, to kind of like trying to apply what worked at PopCap to this new world, and we weren't successful for a variety of reasons. And but I feel like the game that was being worked on was really good, and old PopCap would have let it become itself. And at that point, we were no longer that, and so they ended up canceling it. And I think I regret not being sort of an advocate for them doing it.
And what was it?
It was like what was that game? What was the game? It came from Japan, or I think maybe China. And it was like almost like I think it was called a Match 3. It wasn't the same mechanic.
Puzzle and Dragons?
Well, yeah, Puzzle and Dragons. So it was like it was a little inspired by that, and you would like make these connections between different things, and then depending on how you did that, it would power up. You had a team of superheroes, and it would power them up to do different things, and then depending on what chain you did and how you did it, it could allow combos or triple combos. And so like heroes could have synergies or not synergies with each other. And then you were kind of like playing, you're going through battles and stuff.
We had a couple Puzzles and Dragon clone, like not clones per se, but trying to take that, I don't even know, match RPG type stuff.
Yeah, chaining match. I don't know how much you call it, but yeah.
Yeah, I worked on one for towards the end there for a while that was like a sci-fi themed chaining thing where you're putting together a crew and could modify your ship and stuff and move through like a solar system. Think in some ways like a map somewhat inspired by FTL at the time.
Okay.
But where the main mechanic is doing these different matches of systems that would fire weapons or power shields, a little bit of Star Trek influence there. That was when we actually had kind of a prototyping group. It had a bunch of themes. Sci-fi was one towards the end when I got on it with a couple other people. But I think it had gone through like a potential superhero theme before that.
Mm-hmm.
And then that always came up of being like, oh, if we do a superhero theme, can you really do your own superheroes? Does that work out? Or do you really, if you're going to do superheroes, do you have to go to like Marvel or DC and just say, hey, we want to get a license for this? Because how much do people care about your own made up superheroes?
It just needed an advocate, I think. It needed some external, like, hey, we can do this. And even if it doesn't work, well, let's do this, right? And I think that they were just feeling like that wasn't going to happen under EA. So they ended up making the choice to cancel it. But I think all parties involved, and by that I'll at least say Ben, Jake, and myself. I wasn't involved in the decision. Ben and Jake made that, I think, the call. But I regret not doing that, right? Like,
that seems crazy that in that EA era, it's like, hey, we have an iteration in Puzzle and Dragons that'll work on mobile. That EA is not like, hey, that one? Yeah, go ahead and bring that up to the top of the stack.
They were.
Okay.
That was the thing is they were like, this is great. You should ship it. It's going to make $1 billion. And I said, I swear that didn't help. So that was one where I regret that.
Yeah.
I've gone on record.
If I was going to say which prototype do I kind of, do I wish had sort of worked out?
Yeah.
I mean, other than, there were a couple of the Plants vs. Zombies guys ones that didn't quite make it. There's Yeti Train. There's also, what the heck was that one called? It's sort of a survival island one, which I forget the name of now. It's kind of like a thing where you kind of were trying to survive on a desert island. That was pretty neat.
That sounds cool.
And they had a dinosaur one. I can't remember that name of that one either. But out of the other ones, there was a Bejeweled variant that I worked on called Bejeweled Paradise. Actually, Bejeweled Paradise had a lot of the mechanics that are now seen in a lot of those merge games. There's a lot of these merge dragons and a whole bunch of other games like Triple Town, where you're essentially merging things into different tiers of objects, which I thought was pretty neat, but never quite. It was a bit too different than base Bejeweled, and so it kind of got canceled because it was, as we discovered with Bejeweled Twist, it was kind of, once you got a little too far from the core Bejeweled mechanics, it kind of turned off the core Bejeweled audience. And so, yeah, it seemed like it was best to, if it's going to be a Bejeweled game, you had to do the match 3 stuff, and you couldn't get too far away from jewels and all that stuff.
Thinking of other weird prototypes that did see the light of day, I worked on very early, probably like 2007, 2008, was the prototypes for what became Gyromancer with Square.
Oh, how does that work?
So PopCap and Square, like you can find it's on Steam. That I don't even know how that came about. Like a Square Enix VP came and like had lunch with like the entire team. Like every Friday we would just do pizza in one of the conference rooms when we were small enough. Like the company would just order pizza. We'd go in, get pizza and sit around, and all about that time, 30 of us would just sit and BS about whatever was going on. But at one point, like we had a VP from Square Enix came and visited us, and we could just talk to him about stuff that was going on at Square. And out of that came like eventually these prototypes of being like, hey, I think it was Puzzle Quest was doing really well.
Yeah.
So we're like, Square was like, we want to do a puzzle RPG. And I prototyped for a few months on that out of PopCap. Like it was weird because it was very much like prototype art stuff, and it was using Bejeweled Twist as the mechanic at the time. Make our own stuff and then throw the prototype basically over a wall to Square Enix. That happened a couple times, and then we threw it over the wall one more time. And then the next thing we ever saw of it was coming out. Like they actually had like re-arted it and like made this whole game.
That's so weird. Were you expecting it to be like, this is going to be Final Fantasy Bejeweled? This is going to be sweet.
Actually, originally, yes. And then it wasn't. Like it was, because that's how we prototyped it, as the prototype name was Final Fantasy Bejeweled. Like,
and the Square VP was open about like, yeah, it'd be great to actually use some Final Fantasy characters for this.
No, I mean, that conversation wasn't part of that meeting, that lunch. It was just kind of started those conversations. When I got on, it had already been agreed that this thing was going to happen. But it clearly, they were like, no, we're not going to use the Final Fantasy characters. We're going to give it its own universe.
But with that small of a team for a lot of these games and the size that PopCap got to, I mean, that just must be the tip of the iceberg. There must be hundreds of prototypes sitting on a hard drive somewhere within PopCap.
Well, I don't know. There probably are hundreds of prototypes. We had a tool that we used back then that Brian had written called Burrito, which was kind of a proto Slack. It was a little bit, it was kind of this shared, it was a lot like Slack in some ways, except I guess the big difference was it had more, it also kind of functioned as a file repository and stuff. And it had folders. So it was a little different than the channel structure, but functionally the same kind of idea. So Burrito was full of, again, dozens or hundreds of weird prototypes and experiments. Where Burrito is now is a good question, because it had the other problem of being, because it was sort of a free-form sort of Slack type thing, it got pretty raunchy, and so there's all sorts of commentary and discussions there that probably would give HR nightmares if they ever kind of were to surface in the wrong context.
Oh, Burrito, that was the internal tool that I was talking about that made working there very open.
Yeah, maybe too open at times.
A little bit.
Okay.
I'm sure that has been part of a mini lawsuit against PopCap over the years.
Wait, how so?
Oh, just people were probably way too open in what they were posting there, of being like, oh, this is probably uncomfortable work environment. Shouldn't be talking about that stuff in a place that is being recorded for history. The name of the open, like, general chat area was Zoo Heavy Petting.
Okay. Did you ever get the idea or the concept that it probably made some people uncomfortable in the studio?
Not. I didn't think it made anyone uncomfortable necessarily, but it was definitely more of a like, this is very juvenile. Like, there's a lot of just juvenile stuff that flows through here. Like, majority of people under 30 at that time, and then you're like, maybe this isn't the best place, again, to put something that is being recorded into a database for history's sake.
Right. And now that database is buried in a desert, I believe.
Probably.
Okay.
It got nuked. It got nuked pretty hard.
Is it really wiped completely?
I think so. I don't think they use it internally anymore.
Okay.
Like, when I was leaving, they were moving away from it. And I know that it had, while I was there, they had done a data wipe on it. Like, they went through and permanently deleted a bunch of stuff out of there, of being like, nope, no. There's all the references to Sexy Action Cool as well, which that stuff probably shouldn't be kept around. I don't know if there were straight up lawsuits or not, but there's definitely a thing where people were like, this is probably opening ourselves up for uncomfortable work environment.
A lot of people have talked about, like, yeah, we had this system Burrito that got a little raw.
Oh, you heard about
times. Burrito.
All right. Well, I can definitely kick down some of the real stuff that, like, I don't know, like, how. So I'm just gonna say, like, when I walked in the door of PopCap, it was definitely not a great place for women to work. I'm just gonna say that, like, it was. Like, I literally had a foot and a half out the door because I was not super comfortable being there. And Burrito was definitely a part of that. It was a kind of a free for all. And, it was all these young guys who hadn't, worked in a bunch of companies and certainly hadn't worked outside the video game industry before. And, so I was actually going to maybe leave. And they were like, well, how about we put you in charge? And I was like, I love being in charge. So I totally sign me up, and it's like, they were like, we want you to be in charge and we want you to make it better. And it's like, well, then, I mean, how can I say no to that? Right. Like, that's a really, amazing opportunity to be able to not only, make the workplace be more, welcoming and inclusive for all different types of people, but also, like, make it better for the people that are here to do great work. So, Burrito was an interesting part of my life there. I have to admit, I worked really hard to try to get rid of Burrito for a long time because it was amazing as a game development tool, which is what it was first built as, is a way to collaborate and, share, all kinds of different things. It was like, that's what it was built for, which there are other tools for now. But, at that point, there weren't really those kind of tools. And so that's why it was built, was to build games and collaborate. And it got a little interesting in there.
When it's a lot of, strong majority of guys in their 20s, it's just going to get a little bit rough. Yeah. And with nobody telling them that wasn't, really acceptable in the workplace, right? Like, right.
It was, so that's where I came in. There's a new sheriff in town. I had a little sheriff badge, that my parents got me for Christmas that year. They were like, well, you're the sheriff now. And I'm like, for crying out loud.
But you literally had like the HR sheriff badge?
I did. Well, I'd never been in HR before that, so I reported to the VP of HR, and they had a whole other part of the organization that did all the real traditional HR stuff, all the legal things. Like, my job was really to create a great culture and environment. And so it was culture and facilities. And so I did the remodels of the office and all that kind of stuff too. But like, my job was to make the culture be awesome. And I think I accomplished that, which is pretty darn sweet. It was never we're not going to do this thing anymore. It was, okay. I did take all the liquor out of the kitchens. I can tell you that much. The full bars that were in the kitchens, I did take those out of the office because I felt like that was maybe something that we needed to get rid of. But otherwise it was a conversation.
My name is Jeff Green. I am a consultant, partner, owner of MinnMax Consulting, which I know sounds a little suspiciously like you guys. I thought we did all of our due diligence, legally before we filed for that name, but apparently we didn't do that great of a job.
Very few people think of Googling MinnMax with 2 N's, but everybody that does, God bless them.
That was the problem, right? That was the problem. The problem was your misspelling. But fortunately, we seem to all get along with that. Neither of us have filed. Well, actually, it would be you guys who could probably sue us.
I think we're fine. We're fine. But your history with PopCap, sir.
Oh, yeah, right. That's why we're here. Yes. So I was at PopCap from 2010 through 2013. So I served as the director of social media. Well, I have actually a long history with Jason Kapalka, one of the founders of PopCap. He actually, I don't know if everybody knows this, but he got his start in gaming on the game journalism side. So he was a writer for Computer Gaming World, where I was an editor. I think he wrote our Jedi Knight review, I want to say.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, back in the day. So we knew Jason as a journalist, as a freelance writer, and he let us know one day that he was leaving this field, game journalism, to be a game designer. And he actually either sent us or dropped by the office, it's been so long I can't remember now, a floppy disk with Bejeweled on it. And, it was like written in pen, like Bejeweled, And I remember us looking at it and like thinking like, this is a pretty fun game, but like, good luck to you. How is this ever gonna, why would you be leaving the lucrative feeling of game journalism to make a puzzle game? Little did we know.
I am fascinated by looking back at the time and place for Bejeweled 3. It's such a weird dividing line where it's crazy to me that like that was a physical game that you could go out and buy. Like I remember buying a box at like Walmart. It just feels like that's the ultimate line in the sand for kind of the end of that era.
Yeah. I mean, for sure. I do still think if I was going to name kind of like the best Bejeweled, probably Bejeweled 3 would be the one I would refer to, just because it's sort of, I think, the kind of the best expression of Bejeweled in terms of its overall feel and modes and options. Not necessarily the most financially successful, because I think some of the stuff on mobile has done, kind of made more money, but that one I think had the overall best experience. If I was going to put something in a time capsule for future generations, it would probably be Bejeweled 3. But it's also kind of the last of it's probably the last of the PC oriented ones for PopCap. In that after that was basically around the time when smartphones kind of started to become really dominant.
I walked into a company that was so solidly in the black. They were just like raking in money with no one else to, they weren't beholden to anyone. They were just a private company. So it was just a great vibe. It was a whole bunch of happy people working on really fun stuff. And with no real pressure, right? I mean, the pressure was off. They were just like solidly making money hand over fist. So it was.
I've always wanted to know, what is it like to work at a company that's making that much money? I mean, does it just improve the mood to know like, hey, onward and upward, or are you having champagne for lunch? What's going on over there?
Well, it was not quite at that level, but it was definitely the thing that I noticed was that for better or worse, by the time I got there in 2010, and this was far along in their history, but there wasn't necessarily like a fire under their asses to like make the next great thing.
Yeah.
Like they kind of didn't have to, right? And so it was a little, we would have weekly updates. I would be sitting in meetings with like the heads of marketing, but also the heads of the dev teams, and they would go around and it would, well, so how is the next Bookworm going? And like not much would have happened in the last week, and everybody would kind of laugh about it. And then we go on to the next franchise. Well, what's happening there? Not a whole lot. And it's, I should say, it's not to say that people weren't working hard. Because
right.
Of course they were. Of course, you had like an office full of extremely creative, extremely talented and smart people who wanted to top the last thing they did. So it's not like people weren't working. It's just that there was an ease to it. There wasn't like this like feeling of pressure or doom hanging over everybody, or like, if we don't do this by this date, we're going to get in trouble. It was just a very like cool, friendly, happy place to be.
It's interesting though, in retrospect, because there's storm clouds on the horizon for the entire industry and for PopCap's sense of game design with just free to play stuff. Do you feel like that level of comfort almost hurt the company in some ways because they should have been looking ahead to try and think of how we're going to tackle this oncoming avalanche?
That's a great question. And I do think that to some extent, they got not taken by surprise, but I don't think that they saw things like Candy Crush coming, and Farmville at the time was humongous. Like that was when Facebook gaming started really becoming a thing. And for a long time, PopCap was totally in the right place at the right time in terms of mobile. When mobile gaming started, it turned out that all of their games were so perfect for that platform. Mm-hmm. Because remember, like Bejeweled was a PC game, Plants vs. Zombies was a PC game, Peggle, all of these things started not on a mobile platform. But it just so happens that most of their games were so short in terms of like the time you would spend playing, or that you could get in and out super quickly. They didn't require a major investment of anything really, that they were perfect for the phone. They were perfect for people standing in line or just goofing off for 10 minutes or as a palate cleanser between other games or whatever. So for a while they were in the right place at the right time. But then as like Facebook started to come along and Facebook gaming became a really big thing, and Zynga was on the rise, then it was like, there was this massive influx of competition that I don't know if they had anticipated fully, and that they now had to really start taking seriously.
The same way that people kind of laughed at their design of Bejeweled back in the day for like, this isn't even a game, what the hell? I'm wondering how much internally was happening at PopCap where they're looking at games like Farmville and being like, what is this crap?
Yeah, at first, of course, right?
Yeah.
But, then what happened, of course, was that like, then the pressure started coming internally, like, well, should we make a PVZ Farmville? Which in fact we did do.
Yeah.
I don't know if everybody remembers it, but it was there for quite a while. And a lot of resources that were on other things that some might have arguably said were better or a better fit for PopCap were diverted to things like PVZ Farmville. So there was definitely some reactionary moves made that I don't think PopCap would have made otherwise had Zynga not come around. They probably would have stayed closer to their original mission.
So if you could go back to 2009 at PopCap, how would you brace for impact for both Facebook and mobile? I mean, that is a real turning point.
Well, yeah. I mean, Facebook was interesting in that we kind of ignored it for a while. We kept seeing stuff like, what's this open Zynga and what's this cow game? And, and it was odd because it was like, people were saying, it's like, it's like, this is a real business. People are spending money here. And there's a lot of resistance to that. The idea was that, it can't be real. This is stupid. These games are garbage. No one's really spending money. If anyone's spending money, it's because they got tricked and they're installing, crappy toolbars and it's probably illegal. But I can't believe anyone would actually spend money on a virtual cow. And so it took a while. And then I do remember actually at some point, I think our chief biz guy, Dennis Ryan, basically was making a presentation and says like, look, these Facebook games are making a lot of money. There's a lot of people playing them. And I finally, I think said, oh, yeah, I think he's right. Maybe we should, take a look at this. And that was kind of, then it was like, all right, well, okay, if we're going to do something, I guess we should, dive in and figure something out. And that was kind of the start of Bejeweled Blitz, which was kind of our kind of flagship, in Facebook gaming. So if anything, I would have, if I could go back in time, I would probably told myself to pay attention to that a bit earlier. And that if we'd been a bit earlier on the Facebook kind of gaming wagon, we probably would have done better. If we'd been 6 months earlier on that. Although ironically, where's Facebook gaming now?
Well, hi, I'm Riana McKeith, and I'm an art director working at Trees Please Games. And just over 10 years ago, I started my game career in PopCap in Dublin as a game artist.
In Dublin?
Yes.
What was the Dublin studio specialty?
Well, it was really ahead of its time in some ways because they were the mobile games studio. The Seattle studio at the time was just starting some of its more mobile focused projects, but I think the Dublin office started with the ports of things like Peggle and onto various mobile devices. In fact, I think my first task, if I remember it correctly, was to port a version of Peggle onto a J2ME device of some sort. I don't know I can't remember which device it was, but I remember this like trial of fire of trying to squeeze Peggle onto this tiny phone with a keypad, and make it work somehow. The first sort of big project I did was actually Bejeweled iOS. So that was when we took the Bejeweled 3 game and redeveloped it for iOS. And then I took a more of not quite a lead role, but something more like that for Bejeweled HD under the careful eyes of my art director, Lee. And it was incredible. I mean, I don't think I really appreciated at the time what sort of casual game royalty I was working with. I think I feel that more now. So people go like, wait, you worked on a Bejeweled? And like, even when I was at King, because my previous job to the one I'm at right now was at King, and I was working on Candy and Candy Friends, and they'd say, oh, you worked on Bejeweled? And I was like, yeah, I did. It's like, I made gems, It's always a little bit more challenging being the international office. I think though, we always wanted to make sure that we could prove ourselves and we could make good games and handle these great IPs with care. So I think there was a lot of time and energy making sure that we were keeping Seattle up to date, making sure that they felt comfortable and confident that we were handling their games. So I guess it's that. But I think the PopCap culture was so open and friendly and really special. And I think that transcends even the international side of it. I really felt like a part of the team. I don't know whether this is true or not. I'm going to stray into like wild generalizations, but I think people think of Ireland as being very laid back and chill, as Irish people being very fun loving, but man, do we work hard. And even, this is true of animation as well, and a couple of the other industries, and friends I know who, moved to Ireland for those industries. I'm like, oh, you guys work so hard. And I think one of the things that was reportedly different, and whether this is true or not, I think you're gonna have to double check. But the rumor I heard was that the Dublin office worked really hard in comparison. And I think partly it was because we were so small. I don't actually think we were working any harder than anyone else, but because we were so small, we were able to go very quickly and we were able to achieve a lot with a small team. I'd worked in animation before, but it was my first job in games, and there was a real culture shock of just how much they seemed to care about you as an individual and as an employee, and how much time and effort was put into making sure that you were supported and looked after and had opportunities and had good managers and were recognized for your hard work in a way that I'd never seen before. And I think that's just really changed my whole attitude to what work could be like. And, it seems kind of trite, but I really felt like it was a family and that it was family and friends. It wasn't just a workplace. And I don't think I've ever really felt quite so attached to a job since. Maybe being made redundant was part of that, but I really cared about that place, and I really cared about the games.
Pop was a pretty fun place back in the day because we didn't really have, as mentioned, we could do whatever we wanted, really, because it was just the three of us who could make decisions, and as long as we could pay for whatever stupid thing we wanted to do, we could do some dumb stuff.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I wonder, should I even tell the stories of the holiday parties? Because some of them were crazy. Again, I'd never been to parties like that. It was an eye-opening experience. It's like, what is What? There was an open bar? What is this open bar of which you speak?
So we had some pretty good Christmas parties. I think we had one Christmas party where we rented a whole hotel, and we did this sort of weird murder mystery deal where people were getting kind of picked off by some sort of killer one by one, but then they were sort of ushered into this sort of locked door into another part of the hotel, and where they'd have sort of their own separate party until eventually there's this one lone employee wandering around the halls of the seemingly empty hotel, wondering where the heck everyone had gone. So that was a pretty good party.
The Christmas parties were legendary. I mean, I would go to the Christmas parties in Seattle, and then I'd find some excuse to be heading to Dublin for the Christmas parties in Ireland, a week or two later, as often as I possibly could. I think I went to 5 of the Dublin Christmas parties, and Vechey was always there. Kapalka was always there. We were making a lot of money, and our expenses, our overhead was not very much.
So talking about these Christmas parties, you say they had a lot of money. I mean, was it just, okay, open bar? Like, what is it other than an open bar at these Christmas parties where the money's flowing into these things?
Well, and I don't want to make it sound like they were profligate, because most days of the year we were pretty conservative. We weren't out being rock star game developers or studio or something. But the parties were nice, and it would be held at a different castle each year, and everything was comped. And yes, it's an open bar, but when that open bar closes, when the party officially ends, those kinds of places always had what was called a residence bar, which does not close until the last person staying at the hotel decides they're drunk enough. So those would stay open till 5 or 6 in the morning. So those parties just went and went. And, most of the people attending were Irish. So you had your work cut out for you in terms of just keeping up with the locals. They were crazy times.
And then you get to run around a castle drunk.
Sorry?
Then you get to run around a castle?
You had the run of a castle. You're kind of shit-faced, and everybody who's staying there. So what's the worst that could possibly happen? They catch you asleep in a suit of armor down in the hall in the morning. Big fucking deal.
It was crazy. I'd never seen anything like it. For instance, we had a party for the launch of one of the Bejeweled, I think it was our Bejeweled HD, and a Plants vs. Zombie update, I think. And there was a giant ice sculpture of like a head of a zombie. And then they had tinted, I think it was tequila green. And then they would pour it through the ice sculpture head, and then it would come out the end, and then you take a shot. And it was remember there's 96 of us. It was enjoyed to such an extent that they ran out of tinted green tequila. It was insane. But I think people, what I liked about it was that there was always a line. Like, I think the parties were safe spaces. I never felt that there was many problems, considering how much alcohol was available. People were very careful and sensible. It was like the right mix. You kind of people got just to the right place where they're all merry, and I was very happy, and then stopped, which isn't necessarily always the case. But I thought that was another kind of mark of kind of balance of professionalism that we had then. There was, I don't know, you'll have to see about whether this is there's a famous story about one of our parties, which for me went down as one of these like kind of apocryphal moments where a warning to everyone, everywhere. And we called it Don't Do a Joe. And there was this a man being interviewed for a product lead role. And it kind of went pretty well. Everyone seemed pretty happy with him. And so they invited him to the Christmas party, which happened to be happening the next day. Joe didn't find the line. Like, he ran straight past it.
No.
I feel a bit sorry for him now, because maybe he was just super nervous or something. But whew. So it was chaos. And everyone on Monday morning had stories of what Joe got up to at that party. But I think it culminated with a chase down the hallway where he tried to run away for security guards. And then he was about to be tossed out of the hotel, but they pleaded for him to be let back in because he was staying there that night. So he needed the hotel room. And apparently he snuck in, tried to sneak back into the party through a window in the girls' bathroom or something like that. But in any case...
Was he hired?
No.
Okay. All right. Good.
No. Very much no. Don't do it, Joe. You will not get hired. But I think that was the other thing that I really respected about PopCap. And again, it was something that was quite new to me. I really felt that they took their culture really seriously, like the combination of being a really fun place to work, but making sure there was good boundaries, making sure that everyone really understood that this was a safe working environment, that people were to be treated with respect. And I think and I remember bringing this to other places I worked later, because one of the first things that they did in induction was sitting down and really explain, hey, this is what we expect. This is the level. This is the consequences if, you're found to being sexist or being racist or being discriminated in any way. This is what's going to happen. And I loved that. I felt like it was just, it needs to be said. I wish it didn't need to be said, but it does need to be said. And I think PopCap was one of those places that really took that seriously and would follow through if necessary to make sure to protect the safety of their employees. So this Joe didn't get hired.
It's pretty surprising. A lot of people talked about like, oh yeah, a lot of people like drinking a lot at the studio, and like that combined with that era in the game industry is like, there's no way this is going to be a good mixture. But at least from your perspective, it's like, all right, it was working out well in the Dublin office.
So, maybe, I think there's always a rose-tinted sense of these parties, but like, I felt safe there in a way that I didn't necessarily feel safe in other parties I went to later in my career. Like, I didn't get the problems I got in other parties that I had. Like, obviously there's always issues. There's always, especially as a woman in games, there'll always be some things, but I really felt safe at PopCap, and supported, and like even at the parties, and there was a lot of alcohol. There was no attempt to control the amount of alcohol, but people controlled themselves. I felt like I said, they had fun, but there was a line, and people didn't cross it. And I don't know if that's true in Seattle, but I can say in Dublin, I felt like it was always safe.
Yeah, like we could have these big events where it was like, the booze tab was off the chart, right? For our holiday parties and stuff. We were always safe. We always had valets and things, cab vouchers and all that stuff. But, like to have that kind of environment, but to have a group of people where our responsibility was to care for the individual. And so that if people felt like that wasn't their thing, or they weren't comfortable, or they needed something else, they could come to us and we would have a relationship with them on an individual basis to help them, be awesome and do great work no matter what else was going on.
Yeah, but it was a kind of a learning process to get to that point, you think?
That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And, we really, we definitely toned down the partying as we matured a little bit, as we all do, and it was important to me that we have an environment, like no matter what, you could come in and be successful and happy and healthy.
I noticed you said that Brian wouldn't go to the parties. Was he just not into that scene as much?
Oh, I don't think I said Brian wouldn't go to the parties. He did go to a fair amount of the parties.
Oh, okay.
He was a little more, not aloof, but just kind of separated because like he moved to Argentina or something. Maybe around the time the company was acquired, maybe a little bit before.
Okay.
And maybe he wasn't officially living there yet, but he was spending a lot of time down there. And he eventually married a woman from Argentina, I believe.
Cool.
I could tell you my favorite Garth moment is being on a conference call with the marketing department. It was a week when he and I both live in the Bay Area, but it was a week where I was in Seattle and he was at his home. And so we were having our weekly marketing call. And on his end, all of a sudden we hear like this massive bong rip. And then and we all start laughing on the call because he must have thought he was on mute. And he heard us all laughing and we were like, Garth, it's like 2 p.m. And then he just hangs up. Like he must have been like so high that his only thought was like, I have to get out of here. which was even just funnier that he disconnected.
Probably my memory for me, like biggest thing was working on Bookworm Adventures 2, which was great. And it was me, producer, one artist, and one QA person basically just sitting in an office for like a year. And we just got to make this thing, and we got to make a special version for the PAX a Megathon. It was funny because there was a crowd sitting around watching, and it always came back that thing of all these crowd being like getting really into watching people spelling words.
That sounds so fun. Yeah,
it is fun, and it's ridiculous. That is probably the franchise that I'm like, it's never going to happen. There's never going to be anything more in Bookworm or Bookworm Adventures, but that was always my dream for Bookworm Adventures 3.
The most fun and the most like kind of overwhelmed I think was the first PAX West that we went to, where we had a booth there. And a few of us had the initiative we pushed for this because because nothing was being announced or was shipping at the time of that PAX. I can't remember which year it was, but basically PopCap had nothing new necessarily to promote, but our feeling was like, there's so much goodwill in general towards PopCap, and everybody knows who we are and everybody knows these games. If we just go to this fan-oriented convention, so PAX as opposed to E3, people are just going to like love that we're there. And we had hired, a dance troupe to wear zombie costumes. And so we had them out there doing zombie dances. And then we just had stations up with all our games. So people could just like walk in and just sit down and just play games that had been out for years and years and years that people probably had at home anyway. But the booth was full every day, all day long, with people who just loved our and there was like a line to play Bejeweled and a line to play Peggle all day long. And it's like, man, you could just go sit on your phone somewhere else and play this and not wait in line. But people wanted to just sort of be there and be part of it. And of course we had swag, and everybody wanted the swag. And that was another great highlight, was that I was in charge of that. So we were handing out, I think they were like zombie sunglasses. I can't even remember what it was, but basically the swag was so popular that people figured out that me and another person who worked at the booth were the ones who were going from the booth to the convention like storage area to bring out more boxes of swag. And so people started following us so that they could be there like the second that we came out with the boxes. Like we didn't even make it back to the booth. People were just like, please open the box and give us the sunglasses. So the love was like overwhelming. And for PopCap and for their franchises, it was just really, we were surprised how much people, like we knew everybody liked our stuff, but it was surprising the level of love.
PopCap swag, I think, is one of the best swag in the world. I'm sure people have told you that already. Mm-hmm. I was still wearing my PopCap pajama bottoms like up until literally this weekend when they finally fell apart. And those pajamas I think I got in 2011. They're still there. They're great.
Oh my gosh. Like that was also one of my favorite things. So like we would, as a department, like as a team, like we were responsible for all the PopCap swag. And, oh my gosh, I would love it. I would my office was on the 8th floor, and I would look out my window out into Belltown in Seattle, and I'd see everybody out there walking around in their PopCap gear. And it was just awesome. And at that point, you would walk down the street in Seattle or pretty much anywhere, and you'd have your PopCap stuff on, and people would be like, oh, do you work at PopCap?
We did a first game jam we ever did. It was 24-hour game jam. Probably around 2008, 2009. And it was like, we broke into teams. We were assigned teams. So there was always usually a coder, an artist, other people in the company that wanted to do things. Someone could do audio. And you got randomly generated a name. I think there was a website that would just generate random video game names.
Oh, fun.
And they would just get a random name, and you have to make a game from it in 24 hours. The game that my team got was Unpleasant Horse Racing in the Sky.
Oh, and that's where Unpleasant Horse came from.
Uh-huh.
Fun.
That was our team, and we started at 10 a.m. on a Thursday and went till 10 a.m. on a Friday.
And it was like a 3 a.m. like, where they put the comma after unpleasant horse and all of a sudden it clicked what the game was going to be. And I just love that because they were just like sitting there until like 3:00 in the morning looking at the name, just like, I don't know what we're going to do with this. What is this thing? And then they put the comma in and they were like, got it.
It really was. It was a full, stayed up all night just making that thing, presented it, and then everyone had their bills and people play the next day. And the surreal thing is everyone was just playing that stupid little 24-hour thing and going, this is great.
Jeff Green and I started a label called Fourth and Battery that was really, the intention of that was to give people in the game studio and outside of the game studio, honestly, an opportunity to flex and to try out new skills, and also for us to retain employees for longer at a time when people were starting to get a little burned out on working on like the 8th version of Bejeweled or whatever that they'd worked on. And we just wanted to basically create a little incubator within the company and raise spirits and give people opportunities. And it really did that. There were some examples of like a game developer, a woman who's working in sort of the DRM wrapper department, Sophia, who just like was really just trying to break into the game studio, wasn't having any luck doing that for whatever reason. And she got an opportunity through Fourth and Battery to work on Candy Train and bring it to iPhone. And she did it with the help of her boyfriend at the time, who's now her husband. And they, this is a 2-person team. They worked on it in their spare time, launched the game, and she proved that she was a game developer and she was accepted into the game studio immediately. And, it's like, so it was super successful on that level, but there were games like Unpleasant Horse, which was the first Fourth and Battery release, I believe. And, if you're not familiar, there's like a horse and another horse, and he jumps on them and pushes them into the meat grinder at the bottom of the screen. And, we're calling it Fourth and Battery, but it was like by PopCap, and it was associated with PopCap. And there was some very, very heated, very valid discussions with high leadership about like, are we going to tank our brand by putting out something that's violent? Mm-hmm. After kind of being the company that's known as the antithesis of that for so long.
Yeah, that was a bit of an odd one. I think it was as things were starting to get a little bit more restrictive because of some of the things I mentioned, like some stuff fits in Bejeweled and some stuff doesn't. I think they wanted to have something that would allow for things that were a little bit raunchier. So I think things like that Unpleasant Horse game, which had a higher level of violence than PopCap would normally do. I think that was kind of the idea. It didn't really work that well because it didn't quite have enough of an identity of its own.
I got to give a lot of credit to the people who were in charge of making those decisions. Mostly the founders and the CEO for making the right calls almost every time. And some of them didn't make any sense, but somehow they saw through that. Mind you, it was coming at a time like that was leading into prepping the company for acquisition or a public offering. So, I think that they were looking for places to simplify and tighten up. And maybe Fourth and Battery was seen as just a superfluous kind of unnecessary thing at that time.
I remember you had the podcast at PopCap.
Yeah, that was an experiment, and it was sort of like part of me trying to justify why they hired me in the first place.
Right.
It was like, why did we bring this guy on? Well, he knows how to podcast. He did it before. Maybe he can bring his skills to us here. And it was fun to do. Every week I would sort of gather different devs or different people from different aspects of the company and interview them about what they did and why. And, because it was an office full of like super funny, creative people, it wasn't hard to find guests internally to be on it. I think that the big lesson that we and I learned over the course of the episodes of the podcast was it's really hard to get listeners to tune into a company podcast, no matter how cool the company is, as opposed to, Giant Bomb or the other things who were more impartial or they were more game journalism or personality based. In the end, the PopCap podcast was a company podcast. And it's not like it was a failure. I don't think it was a failure, but there was no way it was ever going to be bigger than, it wasn't going to grow beyond people who were just totally obsessed with PopCap Games, right? Who else is going to actually listen?
Yeah, I remember listening to every episode. I remember there was one moment in particular that always stood out to me, and it's a good podcast moment when it stands the test of time after 10 years or whatever. But
yeah.
It was the Tripletown developer you had on as just like a guest.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I remember there was a moment where at the end of the interview, you're like, well, congrats to you. I hope EA doesn't buy you or whatever. Okay, bye. It's like, holy God, Jeff, that's a bold move.
Wow. I blanked that out of my memory.
We knew we were either going to get bought out or go public. That was what we were growing towards. That wasn't hidden from the employees of being like, hey, we're doing this growth for a reason.
So Microsoft made an offer early on. Do you remember the other companies other than EA that were closest?
I do remember them. I'm not sure if I should. Well, I don't know. It's probably not confidential anymore. I think some of them were like Sierra, I think, at one point. And honestly, then there were a couple others that I think we had one offer from EA that fell apart before the EA offer that did actually go through. So I think that one fell apart. It's one of those things where it seemed to be looking pretty good, and then something happened with their board. I think they got a new CEO or something like that, and then they blew up all the deals. So yeah, I don't even remember anymore.
Yeah,
so.
Zynga must have been interested, right?
Yeah, Zynga was interesting. They were one of the front runners in 2011, and so eventually the negotiations there came down to kind of either Zynga or EA.
We didn't want to work for Zynga. Nobody wanted to work for Zynga because we didn't respect Farmville.
Yeah.
It was really pretty much that simple. It's like, oh man, Farmville, we were already starting to get dragged in that direction of, you got to make games that work on Facebook. And, in order to do that, well, you've got to make all these sacrifices, and the monetization is going to be completely different. So now you got to think about microtransactions, and, those are never fun. I mean, I don't care who you are, what your game is. Those are the opposite of fun. So, that prospect of Zynga, oh man, they're just, that doesn't sound good. And my understanding is they offered more money, and the decision makers went, no.
At the time, Zynga had a kind of a bad reputation for a variety of things, for kind of unscrupulous business practices in the freemium space, which is kind of ironic. So of course now, almost 10 years later, some of that stuff is almost quaint. The idea of, that you're oh, it's so terrible to get people to buy a virtual cow, considering how exploitive some of the freemium, tactics are nowadays.
At that point, when it's the battle of the Titans was there any part of you that was just like, let's just not go to either of them? Was that a voice in the company?
Oh yeah. There's definitely the idea that, something it might not work out or might fall through entirely. So it was pretty high stakes negotiation, right up until the conclusion of it. But ultimately it seemed like it was as I said, a pretty good deal, and it seemed to offer us a lot of latitude to do things, and and eventually we decided that part of it was also, I'd been at PopCap for a decade by that point. So part of it was also figuring out, if there's any, how do you ever leave if you never feel there's a good time to leave. So in some ways that offered that idea that, you could at some point let go of the company because it's, you've sort of relinquished control and it's someone else's problem. But yeah, ultimately the decision to go with EA was that there's this idea that EA had good times and bad times, and there are definitely, horror stories from people about certain eras or, certain, bosses or whatever, to work for EA. But they've been around for, several decades and always seem to survive when things could get bad, and then they came back and so forth. So the theory was that if you're going to pick someone to sell your company to that would be around for the long term, EA seemed like a pretty good bet.
I was actually with my wife and daughter looking at colleges for my daughter on the East Coast. I was in Boston, and I got a call from my boss, Ben Rotholtz, who said, Jeff, it would be great. I know you're on a little break here with your wife and kid, but it would be great if you could fly back to Seattle because we need to talk.
Oh, no.
And I was like, oh, uh-oh. And, when you hear that from your boss, like my first thought was like, I'm getting fired. It's like, well, and then I was like, just trying to process it in my mind, like, would he really fire me? Is this how he would fire me? Would he really pull me back from a family thing? Like, that seems like particularly cruel. And Ben is like such a nice, great guy. He was one of the best bosses I ever had, period. Like, I just didn't think he would do that to me. So I was nervous and I was a little freaked out, but I did do it. I told my wife and kid, I'm sorry, I got to do this. I don't know what's about. I was on the plane going back to Seattle, and I just was thinking like, okay, what could this be? What could it possibly be that Ben would need to talk to me right away? And he sounded so serious. And then I started thinking about, what if it's the acquisition? And then at that point, I remember that EA had been in the mix as a potential buyer. And, I had been at EA for a couple of years, and I had a sort of rather public, I don't know how public it was, but I had a falling out with them. I didn't leave under the best of terms with EA. And so I started thinking, what if it's EA? What if this is why he's bringing me back? Because this acquisition is going to be kind of brutal for me. So I wrote him an email while I was on the plane saying, so I know you can't tell me over email, but I'm just trying to guess here, like, is it something that might be like the worst possible news for me personally? And he said, the reply was something like, I think, we're going to need to talk. So then I had a really strong feeling that's what it was about. And so I came back, I checked into the hotel I always stayed at. And the next morning I met Ben for breakfast. And he said, like, well, I imagine what your worst fear might be, and I'm here to tell you that's what's happening.
Oh, man.
But what was great from there was the rest of that conversation was great, because it was like, we brought you back because we knew you were going to be worried, and we just want to tell you you're fine, you're safe. John Riccatello was not demanding that you leave as part of the acquisition.
Did you think that was even a possibility? I mean,
I didn't know. I mean, things weren't that bad between me and EA, but I didn't know if they were going to be like, oh, great, you have this guy doing your social media, and he's kind of a blowhard, and he says things in public that we don't like him saying, and we don't want him doing that anymore.
Right.
And they were telling me that's not going to happen here. You're safe. You're going to be fine. You're not part of the deal. And in fact, we would appreciate if you wouldn't quit either. So they gave me a little like, please don't quit bonus.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah. And I was like, sure, I will take this money to not quit.
From your perspective, what was the transition to working under EA like?
Well, they did lay off my whole team. So that was it was painful. I'm not gonna lie, it was painful. We had our first, we always, when we were PopCap, we worked really hard to not ever do layoffs. We were, Dave was always really good at balancing out growth and needs with not bloating so much that we would have to make some of those tough decisions. And so our first layoff happened after the EA acquisition, and it was a big one. It was a really big one. And then shortly thereafter, they laid off me and my whole culture team.
Was it because EA culture, EA HR is kind of monitoring this stuff? We don't need you guys anymore?
Yeah, I think their idea was that people's managers and things should be doing some of the things that we did. But it doesn't really work that way. Like, managers have their own jobs to do, right? So it's like, it didn't really, I don't think, work out quite that way. But the idea was that they didn't need the culture team because there should be other parts of the organization that are doing that work.
How do you feel like that worked out?
Well, from what I understand, not well.
I have many of strong thoughts about the acquisition and about getting acquired and the choices we made. I don't spend my energy pointing fingers at EA because I think the grossest mistakes that we made, and by the gross I mean largest, weren't necessarily EA's fault, or like it was choices that we made, either going into the deal, with how we structured the deal, as well as choices that we made once we were within EA.
So when you went into the deal, meaning just the pay structure of like, okay, we're going to buy PopCap, but it's going to be trickling out based on success measurements and stuff like that?
Yeah, there was an overall upfront amount of money, and then there was a system of greater money depending on what our performance was, essentially. And I think that structure was very bad. I think if we had a structure that was just a flat cash structure, we would have made much more inline PopCap decision and ultimately would have made a much better acquisition for EA.
And why is that?
I have strong thoughts about acquisitions and how they are. Well, because we were incentivized to grow. It was like the incentives were to like grow bigger, grow faster, and kind of like swing big. And then, you swing big, you miss a lot. That's part of it, right? And so we almost had this like anti-PopCap incentive, go big fast. And so we do these things that made no sense into rational, but like except unless you were going to say, well, we're going to take a big swing, 75% of the time this is going to strike out. That's why we're doing it. And that's why we did it, and we struck out.
How much of the company did you own at that point? Was it divided into thirds, or what is the structure of this company?
Originally, it was basically a third for each of us at the start. Over the years, there were, we didn't take huge amounts of funding, so we had a couple of investors at various points, but and then employees had some shares as well. So I think by the time it was all said and done, I think I still had, probably 20-25%. We always tried to make sure that no matter what we did for investments, that the founders would still be able to kind of carry any decisions. So that was a big factor. So that, even though we did have kind of more corporate investors and sort of a board and all those things, it was always true that, the three of us could overrule anybody. And so we never had to deal with board things where you might have external, VCs or whatever making the decision for you. So for better or worse, all the big decisions at PopCap, really did come down to, the three founders, being okay with it.
What is it like then when EA buys the company for $1.3 billion, I think is the number out there at least?
It turned out that was the upper end of the deal.
Okay.
If every target had been hit, then that's what it would have ended up as. It didn't turn out to be quite as good as that, but it was obviously still pretty good.
Yeah. What does it feel like to make that much money in one day?
It was pretty weird. I don't know. I mean, the company had been profitable for, pretty much since we'd started. So it's not like we were, it probably would have been more shocking if you were one of these startups that had, been sort of living on ramen for, a couple of years and then suddenly got a check for $1 billion. So, we wasn't quite, that big of a giant shock because we kind of, we knew we'd be okay regardless of if the deal fell through or not. But it was still pretty surprising to get a check like that. I think we even got a big giant novelty check at some point. One of those humongous, game show type checks.
What do you do? Do you go home and have a nice bottle of wine? Do you just go out for a couple beers? Do you stay awake at night, late that night, go like, oh my God, this is so much money?
Well, I mean, I think, part of it was just the stress of just getting a deal like that done, which was things like, at some point going into some lawyer's office with a stack of documents 3 feet high that you had to, sign everything. And then I think, in terms of the celebration, I think, what do we end up doing? I think basically all the executives went to, I think we were at this, some sort of, place in California, some kind of like, corporate retreat in California where, we'd finish our discussions and stuff like that. So I think honestly, I think the bunch of us went out and got drunk and then passed out in our, some sort of yurts, some sort of weird little huts in California.
this is a naive question. Do you just ever just daydream about like, what could I do with this money? There's so many options. I could just go buy an island, go live on that. Do you ever just have a good, rich brainstorming session?
Well, kind of. I mean, and to some extent, that ends up being the story of kind of what I've been doing post PopCap, because I did go off and try and do a bunch of other stuff. So, it's kind of I mean, obviously, this is the epitome of first world problems.
Yeah.
What do you do if you have a bunch of money? And I guess when people ask the question like, what would you do if you had $1 million? Of course, nowadays, $1 million, maybe get a down payment on a house in the Bay Area or something like that. But the idea, if you had a bunch of money, what would you do with it? That's a sort of a different kind of question. And I did some various charitable things, donated to some charities and set up some scholarships at my old university and some other stuff like that. So some of it is that. Some people like doing kind of those kinds of charitable things. And I continue to do those, although those are hard decisions too.
Yeah.
Because once you start looking into that sort of things, nothing is simple there either. Like, Bill Gates, who's giving away more money than I guess probably just about anybody else, is not exactly universally loved for that. He's got plenty of people who, think he's trying to microchip them or do whatever. So there's that kind of problem. And then there's also just the thing that sometimes you have unintended results. I think I was planning on donating a bunch of money to this charity that, I'd done a bunch of research, and they were a charity that made mosquito nets largely for Africa. And it seemed like a really great deal. So the idea is like the mosquito nets, whatever you put them in, they cost, very little, and each, they'll prevent malaria. And so theoretically, this fairly small, kind of amount of money could save a lot of people's lives. So it seems like, that seems like a pretty good choice. Then I think the day before I was going to do that, someone came over with a story where it turned out what was happening with these mosquito nets in some of these areas is that people were getting mosquito nets and using them to fish. So they're repurposing them as fishing nets, but they basically string them up across rivers and whatnot, and sort of essentially wiping out the fish supply, which then had all these huge environmental ramifications, because suddenly the fish supply was kind of gone for potentially years or forever. And that's like, who would have ever thought that mosquito nets would be something that could cause this disastrous ramification. So so even when you think you're doing something that's unilaterally good, it's not always the case.
You have experienced what very, very few people on Earth have, like built up a company, especially a video game company, and then sold it for hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yeah.
How does that feel? Is it as satisfying as everybody clawing to get in your position would like to believe?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, that's a tricky answer. Ultimately, what I'm most proud about is not that we got acquired for $750 million. That's irrelevant to all the things I love about PopCap and what we were able to do, right? And so in that sense, it's irrelevant to the things that matter most. I think from a life standpoint, the problem is, you go from not having a lot of money to having a lot of money, through a thing like an acquisition. You're not prepared for it. You're still you, right? Like rich you has the same values, the same issues, the same challenges, the same insecurities as not rich you, except you have a whole society now telling you're awesome, making your life convenient, right? And so when I think about PopCap and that side of things, I think that like, it's just indicative that something's broken. Like why the hell should someone get hundreds of millions of dollars for making video games? It's dumb. It's wrong, right? In my opinion, it's wrong. It's just flat out wrong, right? But then that's true of everything you can think about, in my opinion, right? Like Because I'm not like saying video games are bad or making video games are bad. It's awesome to make video games. It's awesome to be in the industry, right? It's great to connect with people through games. So it's like, I love games, but that, again, it's like that there could be so much wealth inequality, and that exists just because you make something that makes lots of money, and then that becomes valuable to other people, and then they extract the value from it, right? That to me just says like, we didn't make it. We just exploited a broken system, right? Right. And one that's so fundamentally broken, no matter how far you go back, right? Like, I was born in America. I was born in the Midwest. Like, there were people living here, right? There were a lot of indigenous people living where I was born, living where I live now, you know, and my family journey was one of coming here and essentially kind of oppressing other people, whether that was through indigenous people, through slavery, through gender, right? And so when I look back, I'm like, okay, well, yeah, like we did this awesome thing. We made this big company, but like it really is opportunity theft. It is land theft. It is wealth theft. And so that there's this thing that it's hard for me in reconciling. PopCap was good in many ways. It was still based on these fundamentals that our society was based on, and they wouldn't have happened. I wouldn't have been able to do that without that privilege and those opportunities. Yeah.
So what do you do now? You still have a lot of power. And imagine you haven't spent all the money on the house that we're seeing a little bit behind you. I mean, do you lose sleep about this? Do you brainstorm different ideas about how to kind of pay it back towards society?
Yeah, I mean, I lose sleep about this, absolutely. I think we've got to get to a different world, one where wealth doesn't exist. And so when I think about that, it's not just like, well, how can I give back? How can I, like the Bill Gates, right? Talking about like climate change, flying around in private planes. Like, that's bullshit. He shouldn't be as powerful as more than half the nations in the country because of how much wealth he has with the Gates Foundation. What I think about is like, one, how do we transfer wealth and power to those who have been most affected by the systems that we have, right? Because like, I mean, I'll just give like, the people who should have control over how we use this land here and what our societies are the indigenous people that were here that we stole the land from, right? So what can I do to not make this my story, but how can I help and support indigenous people, right? Because they're the ones we need to give that land back. We need to give that political power back, that economic power back, because they're going to make different decisions because they've been fighting against these things that are causing so much suffering to the majority of human beings.
Yeah. Do you feel like is that rubber hitting the road? I mean, there's a lot of ideas here, but do you think about just, okay, what can I actually do to make an impact on the ground right now?
Yeah. So, it's conversations, and I think it's not me taking a place of leadership. It's me showing up and being like, hey, how can I help you? Right. That's ultimately the question that has to be answered. Right. And going on my own personal journey of how to turn back colonization within myself as best I can, knowing that I can't do it fully. I can't. And how do I help my kids do it? And then how do I show up as someone who's coming in to help, and realizing that, like, what that means, right? Or in the South. So, I mean, I'm trying to do the best I can. Yeah. And I can always do better, and I always will do better. But it's ultimately like a multi-generational struggle that I think we have to do. And so, to me, when I think about PopCap, I think about it in that lens, right? Like, I mean, it's just simple stuff like, so someone can make, a small group of people can make hundreds of millions of dollars from making video games, and some people don't have clean water. That any reasonable person looking at that would say that's a ludicrous society,
right?
But yet we keep doubling down on it. So it's like, ultimately, the thing I ask myself, what can I do every day to help that?
I never got the greed vibe from any of those guys, honestly. And I'm not saying that. I haven't talked to any of them in 10 years.
Yeah.
Right. And I was like, I'm not one of the people that like got ridiculously rewarded by the acquisition either. Right. So it's like, I have no reason to cut them any slack. But except for the fact that they built a company that gave me the greatest game industry job that I've ever had, and a wonderful opportunity to somebody who had no real game production experience, only audio direction experience. So I am grateful for that. But I don't think greed was their motivating factor. I think that they had a blueprint and a map for bringing that company up to a place to make it the most appealing acquisition target or IPO target. And that was all happening and probably motivated by what was going on in the industry at the time.
From a cultural standpoint and an interpersonal standpoint, the money didn't really change things. You know, I never noticed John Vechey or Kapalka or Brian Feet or Dave Roberts or anybody else changing because of the money, which was substantial.
I think John Vechey bought a Bolt. I think maybe was the car that he bought, so it's not like all of a sudden people were out buying like Lamborghinis or something, which would have been weird. It would have been really weird if that had happened. I think maybe, a couple of them bought a bigger house, it's like, which is totally fair, but it wasn't this, nobody's coming in with their Rolexes and they're driving their, Lambos and like popping the Dom or, that was not like, where it was a very humble, pretty humble group of people, I think.
With the acquisition, did every employee get a cut of that? Did you get a
we all had different people had different shares in the company.
Okay.
So no, it was not evenly distributed. Some newer people who were there less than 6 months got nothing from it because you needed 6 months to vest any shares. So I think that there was some discontent from people who started and that happened. And but then there were plenty of us who'd been there a while. Like I did fine with it.
Are we talking over 50,000?
Yes.
Over 100,000?
Yes.
Over 200,000?
No.
Okay.
I was able to pay off student loans and have a down payment on a house. So that felt great.
Yeah.
But many other people I knew that were there years before, they made millions on the whole thing.
It took the whole organization to be that successful, and those guys absolutely knew that and took care of people. It was amazing. They are the gold standard of how I would want owners to handle an experience like that, because they didn't change. They were still the same guys and they really took care of people. Like every time I have gone through it subsequently, those guys were the gold standard of that.
Yeah, that's nice. I mean, are you personally making over 100,000 from the acquisition?
Yes.
Over 200,000?
Yes.
Over 300,000?
Yes.
Over 500,000?
Yes.
What?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
No, I walked out of that acquisition with about $700,000. And
now you're set for life, or is Seattle that tough?
Well, I mean, I pocketed it away because I also am like, I don't need a Lambo and a Rolex, because people would wonder what happened to me if that, like, they'd be like, where's Ellen? What have you done with her? And, so I pocketed it. I like totally was like, all right, I'm going to give this to my investment guy and he's going to do his thing. And so it's the graph is up and to the right, and that's all. That's the only thing I want. And at some point I'll decide that I don't have to work anymore and I'll, kick back, but I don't know if I'm quite there yet.
You're living the life.
I got dogs to save,
So the way John talked about it, and Jason as well, it made it seem like they were incentivized as a company to be more profitable because then they made more with the acquisition. And did that trickle down to all the developers as well? So even on the ground floor, more people are like, yeah, let's do more free-to-play stuff because we will make more from this acquisition as well.
Kind of, because that's when we made our own decisions there. Like the EA didn't force that. We said, you buy us at this price. Here's the milestones that we've agreed to. If we make the X amount of money in Y amount of time, we will get a bonus. I don't know if it trickled down all the way, but it definitely shifted in all right, we've told them what we can produce. Now let's make that happen from a straight monetary value. And I guess at that time I got moved on to Bejeweled Blitz on iOS, which was one of the iOS hadn't come out for Bejeweled Blitz. I went on for the last 4 months of development to help get that out, which was super successful. But there was a focus on okay, what was back then? It was iOS, free to play iOS, and then social games like Facebook games and things like that were where the money was. So it was focus on that because we want to hit these targets that we've agreed to. So was that good? Probably not. I think I got put on eventually was on one of the better focused teams there. I mean, Bejeweled Blitz had been on Facebook on before and was just it wasn't even when it released had a way to make money at all. It was just a 1 minute Bejeweled game that you could play on Facebook. That's it.
It was great.
That was a afterthought in some ways.
Right.
We're oh, it's successful. It's free. How do we make money on this again? It definitely hit a point where it's a lot of designs just don't work in free to play. Peggle, they tried a free to play version of Peggle on phone, and it doesn't work the same. Those designs were not thought of in a free to play market.
Yeah.
They were never created in a free to play market, so it became challenging, I would say, for the teams and different people to try to adapt to that. I mean, I worked on the Bookworm Heroes, it was a word battling, think about our words with friends, and it didn't, I did development and design. It didn't work out well in the end, but it had a lot of pushback with how we wanted to monetize, even as a team, because we're we want to do this more in the League of Legends style, where we sell heroes with rotating heroes and stuff. But we had well, that doesn't make. I remember being told specifically that won't make enough money. You can't do that. And I'm well, the game's designed to do that. That's what it has. They have to put something else in. And at that point, that was, I think, a common thing for a lot of games.
I know that Bookworm was a franchise that was a case where there was a desire to impose free to play and monetization onto what was going to be the next iteration of Bookworm. And the guys who were the devs who were in charge of that franchise just didn't want to do it. They didn't want to be any part of that. And of course, because of the buyout and because of the nice amount of money that all the longtime folks at PopCap got, they were under no obligation to stay and finish the game. And they basically were well, yeah, we're out of here. We don't want to make that game. We're leaving.
Yeah. It's such a weird cycle to think of the genre that PopCap certainly elevated, sped up, the casual genre, if you will, then gets taken over by the free-to-play tsunami. That then sensibility tries to get shoehorned back into the originating games from PopCap, and it just never is a good fit, and then everything falls apart.
Yeah.
That's such a weird loop.
It is a weird loop. The people that were, a lot of them making the games, especially right after that, weren't people, I will say myself, not, we had not been really steeped in that kind of free-to-play market. That's just not where our brains originally went to on how do you make these things, when Candy Crush comes out.
Yep.
Why does Candy Crush? But they had really stripped away a lot of things and added in okay, how do we design this as a free-to-play game that makes money? Very much focused on just making money. There wasn't a whole lot of talk, especially for a long time, about how do we sell this? How do we make full money off of it? Mm-hmm. It's we make a good game that we really enjoy, and then we figure out how to sell it.
Yeah.
That was a pretty standard thing of and let's be honest, most developers don't get that chance. They don't get the runway to be well, we get to fully finish a game, and now we get to actually figure out how to sell it. Mm-hmm. Most developers would run out of money long before they got to that point. Thank you, Bejeweled, for being very successful in letting us experiment and have fun for a long time.
It was interesting, there was a lot of new IP that was in development there, but there was, pressure from above, pressure from all over the company to make the next PVZ.
Right.
How do we ensure that this game is the next PVZ? And that's a really tricky notion, because PVZ at the time was not the next PVZ. Like, they had no idea if that game was going to succeed or not. And I don't think it was a bad thing. I think it was a natural tendency of these folks who were super creative and super hard on themselves as creative people, as to whether, well, is this really as good as we think it is? Is this really as good as every other PopCap game? They didn't want to release a game unless they knew it was a home run. Which
is really wild from a company with a track record of releasing, 50, 60 games. Like, for so long, they were just cranking games out. Then it just slowly started to slow down. And everybody realized, like, oh crap, we have a legacy to uphold here. Right.
So the pressure was sort of like self-imposed. It's like, we need to make sure that this game is really as good as everything out. We do not want to tarnish the PopCap reputation by putting out something mediocre. And so that became the thing. Like, can we all be convinced? Can they convince themselves that this is really PopCap quality? And so, unfortunately, like, some things kind of didn't make the cut because there was a little bit of worry around that. They probably didn't need to worry.
PVZ2 came out and it's a tablet mobile thing first, and like they're like, well, look at what EA did. I'm like, I think the most misconception is that EA forced any of that on us. Like, that was most of those choices, if anything, were all internal choices that were chosen long before we ever got bought out.
So I worked on the Xbox Live version of PVZ, which was the first console appearance of the franchise, and it was a tough project. They wanted to kill me most of the time because I was just applying pressure, and I was still kind of a new game producer at the time too, just doing my best. But we rallied, we got it done, and the success of that project made me a good candidate for doing a similar thing with the PVZ2 team. Now, they had been struggling for an entire year, just spinning their wheels in this room that had like money-colored carpet.
Wait, literally?
Yeah, it was like this green money-colored carpet. That's my characterization.
Okay.
I don't think someone was like, let's put the money-colored carpet in there, but it was definitely money-colored. Like, you could put $1 down on the floor and it was the same color. They had received some pretty bad direction, which had led them down this path of creating kind of like a Farmville tower defense hybrid, and it wasn't working. And they had tried it. Morale was and progress was kind of like minimal at that point. And so I was helped to reignite the passion and sort of help that project find a new North Star. So we moved the team to a new space. We rebooted. And we began with evolving the visual style, which was contentious and controversial. I mean, that game has such an iconic look, that was, everybody owes the credit of that to Rich, who created the art for that game. And he was not involved in this new version of the game. And George Fan wanted to be left alone to create his new game, which was all totally understandable. So this gave the PVZ2 team, though, the impression that they really didn't have like the full support from the originators of the game. And I don't want to be unfair about that. Like, they would pitch in and they would jump on a call or they would help out or whatever, but they really wanted some space away from this thing that had probably just gotten kind of overwhelming for them at that time. I mean, this is like the biggest game in a long time. And that, like, those road cone hats were like the biggest thing at PAX. It was just like, PVZ was everywhere. I remember walking from the bathroom to my seat on an airplane and just like counting who was playing PVZ, just like, walking down the aisle. It was like every third row was somebody playing PVZ, right?
Yeah.
So it was just a huge deal. And I don't blame them for wanting to get a little space, but the new team just felt like, okay, we got to do this kind of without them.
And this is before the EA acquisition?
Correct.
Okay.
I think, though, those guys kind of knew what we didn't know yet, which was that the beloved game's legacy was at risk of being polluted by like these competing interests that were coming from sources outside the team that was working on the game, which I'll get to in a second. So I think they probably saw something that we didn't, and that's why they were keeping their distance. You'd have to ask them to be sure, though. So we moved through the visual style exercise, and we found this happy medium between higher fidelity visuals and smoother animations. And this is when I was told very clearly that the leadership wanted the game to be free to play. And this is at a time when Zynga ruled, and unbeknownst to most of us, the company was being groomed for an IPO or an acquisition. So like we got this direction, like free to play would be really awesome. So, okay, we'll try. We were stuck in the middle point between this desire to bring the game into this new place, this new business model, and this huge bank of equity and momentum and just love for the previous version. So it's like, create a sequel that doesn't totally just all over the expectations of this huge fan base that's like creating fan art and fan fiction and sending you cards written by like 5-year-olds and like people when you're drawing your blood are just like, oh my God, I just took too much blood out of your arm because I was talking to you about how much I love PVZ. Like, everywhere you went, it was driven home that like, don't f this up.
Mm-hmm.
Like, right? And then you've got this other group of people saying, also don't f up the fact that we need to play in this new space. This is our primary franchise right now. And we see this as a huge opportunity. There was a genius designer on the team, Mohan Rajagopalan, who came up with this concept of plant food, which was a consumable, and it didn't totally break the legacy gameplay because it was a bit superfluous. It was like you could use it to buff your plants or not. And so you could hypothetically monetize it through microtransactions. If you wanted to sell plant food as packs or whatever, it would effectively just make the game easier for people. So if they're having trouble getting through a level or something like that, they could go and spend a little money on some plant food and they could get through that level. And so we felt like that was a nice compromise.
Yeah.
And then we also created like a content pipeline that was less reliant on like one person hand drawing every image and asset. And then like Rich Warner like hand animated every one of those characters. And so we needed a more sustainable pipeline so that we could actually do what we wanted to do, which is create content packs so that they could be sold or given away for free. That was a decision to be made by the business people, but we wanted to sort of lift the ceiling off of what could be spent on a premium game by saying, hey, you buy the game or you give it away for free. I don't really care what they wanted to do. And at the time, people would go put games on sale all the time. Like you could do that, right? So like you can decide on a weekly basis how much you want to charge for it. And also we'll make the game able to consume content. So you could release new content and sell it or give it away or whatever you wanted. And you could monetize the plant food. So we felt like we had this really great plan that struck a nice balance between increasing the potential for new avenues of monetization and also not breaking the game. And so it was a big job. It was like new art style, new levels. We had things moving in the levels for the first time. We had a whole world map where you would like, it was kind of, at first it started to look like Mario, like it was like the snowy world and the sandy world, but then we had like pirates and outer space and all this cool stuff and lots of great concept art for how the zombies would look in all those different environments. And the team really just busted their asses. And so then somebody came to me and said, like in an emergency, like we need to see what you're doing. We need an example of this proposal like right now, let's see. So there was this sense of urgency all of a sudden, and it was fair. We'd been working for like 8 months or 9 months or something like that. So the team rallied and we made a vertical slice, and it was like totally experiential, totally playable. Plant food was in, it looked really great, it sounded cool. It was like you could play what we thought was like a really nice 2 or 3 levels of the new PVZ Evolution, the sequel. And they took the prototype and they played it and we presented it and it was like pretty successful. But it came with the subtext that like, we don't think that making this game truly free to play, what free to play was looking like, it was meaning at the time. We don't think that that's possible without breaking the game. The game is like this interwoven, meticulously hand balanced by George Fan set of interdependent components. So like every plant has a zombie that it depends on for that balance. And like just making sure that, you know, that whole thing was woven together in that like perfect lineage and that perfect experience was just a magic trick that, you know, you can't mess with.
Yeah.
So we were kind of strong about that. It's like it was one of the things we learned. We tried actually, and we learned that you can't do that without, I think, disappointing a whole bunch of people. So that was our statement. We showed them the vertical slice, and they went to play it. And shortly after that presentation, it was announced that EA was acquiring PopCap. And so suddenly a few things like snapped into place, right? I was like, you know, I assumed, and then it was confirmed to me that like one of the questions was like, what's up with PVZ2?
Yeah.
Before they wanted to acquire PopCap, they wanted to know what was up with this really important new next sequel of this like huge franchise. And that vertical slice answered that question successfully. Like they were happy with the response that they got to that question by looking at the work of this team. However, it wasn't free to play, right? And so I just want to acknowledge that the remarkable work that early PVZ2 team did to assist with the acquisition in this way. I don't think they were ever properly recognized for that, in my opinion. And I think that they did the company a great service by putting in so much work and dedicating themselves to making sure that what they produced there was a high quality vertical slice playable prototype. So a few weeks later, I'm visited by John Riccatello, the CEO of EA, and he comes to meet the producer of PVZ2. He wanted to look at progress, and he took me aside for a little one-on-one, and he wanted to tell me how much his kids love PVZ, and super nice guy, totally cool, and I found him like incredibly relatable, especially, you know, like, and you know, the game industry is full of super relatable people, even at the highest level, so it wasn't that surprising. But he was new to me, and I was new to him, and he didn't make me feel that way. He made me feel like, you know, just another one of the team. So he said, you know, my kids love PvZ, and they always bring me these ideas. And one of them was so good, I just had to share it with you, right? So he said, my son suggested, what if you rented plants, and you could rent a plant and it was like consumable and expired over a course of time. You could use it for a while, but it was like you made the plants rentable. And doesn't that seem like a great idea? And it just went against everything that we had just learned. Like if you have that interwoven fabric of all these elements and you pull one of them out, like the whole thing unravels.
Yeah.
So I was like, I tried to explain that to him, and you know, I don't always expect people in leadership positions to get everything, but this one was really important, and it was like, you know, here I am being sort of asked by the CEO of the company that's about to acquire. It was still in process, like the whole acquisition those things take a while.
Yeah.
And it was just like a high pressure moment for me, and I just was like, let me talk to the team, and we'll get back to you, right? And it just, everybody was horrified, right, by that. And
but there's no universe where his kid recommended that.
Good, fair point, right? Like I took it at face value, and so then I was like asked by others in leadership to do more to address this request, and if not that one, then make the game more like existing free-to-play games. And I put so much equity into the proposal that the team had spent so much time exploring and supporting. And I'm like, you know, I'm the producer on the team. I'm the product owner. I'm going to stand by my team. And I said, I don't think it's possible. I'm standing by our proposal. We've tried. We don't think this is a good idea. And what we recommended was, if you want to make a free-to-play PvZ, start from scratch. Let us make this premium game that bridges the gap between just pay once and play the whole game. But there's opportunities to sell stuff into the game. The business team can start to get used to that. We can experiment, use it as a testing ground for things or whatever, but we won't totally destroy the legacy of the game by doing that. It's like a stepping stone.
Yeah.
And start now on a free-to-play version of PvZ that's built free-to-play from the ground up so that you're not breaking anything.
Right.
And I just stuck to that. I was like, I think this is the best idea, but I'm just a producer. But this is this is what I think you should do, and this is what I'm going to stand behind. And then, what happened shortly after that was I was removed from the project. A new producer that was more amenable to the direction that was being asked for was put into my place, and then shortly after that, I was sort of asked to leave the company.
But like the Plants vs. Zombies team was crunched for so long, we didn't support the team, which again, very counter to PopCap. EA wasn't saying don't support the game. If we had said, hey, we're going to release this as a premium game and then start working on the Plants vs. Zombies free to play, I think that everyone would have been fine with that from an EA standpoint. I mean, they would have questioned it, but that's okay. So like that's indicative of that. And I think that a lot of the team felt really burned. And I think it was a really sad moment for PopCap in some ways because we weren't able to celebrate what was a pretty big launch because there was all this unspoken frustration from all directions. And I think a lot of people fell into toxic behavior, which is natural when you're in a toxic environment like that.
And I understand your management, so this is a weird question, but is it just management greed then? Or why not just follow what the team is hoping to happen?
Well, I feel like you just asked a labor question, so I really like that. I mean, I think it's incentives. Right? It's contradictory incentives to some extent, but it wasn't just the manager. It wasn't just management labor type things. I mean, I would characterize many things, I'm a big fan of that lens. In this case, I think it was almost stupid. I mean, I was part of the management side. So it's like, it was stupidity. It was being blind, is wishing for something to exist that didn't exist. It was, it was like, if that didn't happen, what was going to happen to PopCap as we knew it was going to go away. And so, there was the incentives of the earn out. There was also like what's PopCap's place within EA? Like, you get the acquisition, everyone's really excited, but then you don't have that success that everyone wants. And suddenly you're not cool anymore in the company.
Right.
And so it's like, they bought us to be the Pixar. We didn't deliver was one story, was not the truth. And then, or they bought us to be the Pixar, but then we stopped being the Pixar. Right? We broke everything to then be part of it for this deal. It was all of those things. It wasn't none of them. Honestly, I think the team was the most innocent in that. And then I think they tried their best. And then towards the end, I think there was a lot of real frustration and anger that maybe wasn't communicated the best. But at that point, in retrospect, I don't really blame them for that. They were working their ass off, ass off for a long time with something they didn't believe in and trying to make the best of it from a creative standpoint and a business standpoint. And they launched a game that had more downloads than any other game in the history of iOS in the time period in the first week, right? And there was no problems, right? There was no server crash. It's like they did technically this big feat from a product standpoint. So it's like they did so much. I certainly don't blame them in retrospect for the feelings they were feeling in that moment.
Yeah.
And I regret many of my choices. So I don't think there's the root cause analysis is we sold the company under a certain amount of incentives and a certain perspective. And that rewarded the shareholders of PopCap, of which I was a large one, being a founder, and we didn't take a bunch of VC investment, so I can't blame those assholes. No offense to any VCs listening.
There were a lot of new people in that company.
Yeah.
That came in from all these different parts of the industry. And I certainly saw and was being presented with decisions that, to me, didn't map to making the best game. It mapped to making more money, possibly at the expense of the quality of the experience. And I don't know what motivated that calculation, but wasn't really my in my wheelhouse to be concerned with that. And honestly, at the end of the day, you choose. Right? Every individual gets to choose. Like, you decide, do I want to make this game? Do I want to stand behind this? And I stood behind what I thought was the right thing to do, and I was actually not that surprised when I was told I wasn't the right guy to lead the project, because I knew of that too. Like I said that to you.
Yeah. But Riccatello's kid loved PVZ2 when it launched. He was over the moon. I don't know. He said, renting plants? Now this is gaming.
He's like, I'm in the credits. I designed this game.
So yeah, I mean, I think it was just a bunch of things coming together to create that storm that was, I think, very on PopCap, right? Like, independent PopCap would have never pushed a game to be what it wasn't. It would have always tried to figure out, how do we help the game be what it is? Or it's okay to cancel a game, right? That was okay. It was safe to do that. It wasn't failure of everybody involved to cancel the game. So that's kind of how I look at that phase. It's complicated though. I mean, you can hear it in my voice. I'm like, when I look back, I'm like, oh, okay, well, the system of saying that you're going to have these people that own this thing that gets to this size, that I think is inherently destructive. And that is a key part of the problem I think that we have, because when things get so big and they become financially driven in and of themselves, they start getting horrible. Whether they're, and that looks different in many different companies, but it's a pretty consistent trend. So when I look back at the regrets, there are things that I couldn't change. So I feel like in every decision, I made the best decision I could. But there's some fundamental decisions that I think were really bad in the long run. And we got those ramifications of that, if that makes sense.
We felt pretty confident in our position, in our jobs and our job security at the time. Because Dublin studio was doing pretty well, and we had some good projects, and there was like certainly ones that were taking over pretty well, and we had some projects in the back pocket. But we had been bought by EA the year before, and restructuring is natural in those circumstances. The way it happened was a bit unfortunate, because the news broke online in the morning before any of us knew. And so we walked into the studio in the morning and people said, "Oh, did you see what's online?" And I was like, "What?" And they're like, "Oh, major changes, major layoffs in PopCap." And I was like, "What's happening?" That can't be us though. I mean, it can't be us that we do this and we do that. And our project is like, so, I mean, I was completely in denial. And then the message came around, it's like, "Oh, all hands meeting." And we were like, "Oh, okay." I mean, I was devastated. I think it was really tough. I think it was partially because I loved the place so much, and I loved the games and I loved the team, like the quality of people there. It's hard to find that sort of quality again. It was such a strong team. So it was really hard. And I think that everyone felt it. This was the first time PopCap had a round of redundancies, I think. So everyone felt it. And, I just remember standing in the beautiful kitchen. The whole office had only recently been renovated. And just kind of watching this, being told that we were all being made redundant. Because at that point we were like, oh, maybe some of us, but no, it's the whole studio. And it was like, poof. I think it taught me a lesson though, right? So now I feel like I'm much more aware and I understand things a lot more. Like, you can spot signs, and it's meant that, I've been able to make smart decisions in my career. By kind of going, this feels familiar.
Right.
Maybe it's time to move on. But at the end of the day, it's a business, and businesses have to make tough decisions. And that's kind of why I don't ever quite feel the same way about another job, because there's that part of you which is like willing to kind of give your heart and soul has been like, maybe not 100%, maybe only 90% heart and soul. The rest, we keep that 10% for sanity.
They left us alone for about a year and a half because we had an earnout period where if we hit certain numbers, we got another kind of additional infusion of payout money from the acquisition. As that sort of came to a close, there was a lot more of, okay, we're consolidating. All marketing now is going to report through this channel, and it's
Right.
the comms people report to a guy in Santa Monica at EA, and the design or graphics people report to someone in Redwood Shores, and so forth. So over time, there was that cultural change.
No matter how sincere anybody's intentions are when they say, and this goes for any company in any business, when there's an acquisition and the people who are being acquired say, don't worry, nothing's going to change. The company
Right.
culture is not going to change. It's not true. They may believe it's true and they may be sincere about it, but it's just not true. Like when you're acquired, like everything changes, and you are now owned by people who are not the people who created the company culture. Like by definition, things are going to change. It can't be helped. And I believe that Jason and John Vechey and everyone else was completely 100% sincere in their belief that things weren't going to change, but things change.
I think some of the biggest challenges that we had were we were holding on to this PopCap thing and not creating the EA PopCap thing and not knowing even how to create the EA PopCap thing, right? And so I think that really hurt. I think that hurt the acquisition from being more successful. Because the reality is I think that the acquisition was, on the whole, negative, right? So if you just take the different stakeholders, the majority of PopCap employees would have rather had stayed at a company that was a pretty good company and just continued to do what they were doing, whether they were marketing or QA or customer support or game development. It's like we're all part of the game process at PopCap, and everyone felt that from accounting to everything. And that was really important to us. And most people would have rather continuing to work for that company than any kind of payout from an acquisition. When you look at it from the customer standpoint, PopCap was a pretty prolific company. Even if we didn't release a lot of titles, we were always very consistently doing things. And I think that hasn't happened as much. And I think customers would rather have more than less. Right. So like customers kind of lost out in that equation.
In the EA years would kind of start off with, it's like, okay, so this idea, is this $1 billion idea? Can it become a $1 billion franchise? And it's like, geez, I don't know. I mean, maybe. I mean, none of the games that turned out to be $1 billion franchises look like $1 billion franchises at the start. I mean, they look like a Colors game, and then Flower Plants vs. Zombies, which again was a very experimental, weird game that our business guys at the time did not have any faith in at all. They thought it was going to be just too obscure, too hardcore, too morbid. They didn't really expect much from it. So,
but for something like Solitaire Blitz, somebody would pop in, I'd imagine just some EA executive, and says, is this really going to be $1 billion idea here?
Yeah, kind of. Yeah. I mean, that was sort of the idea when you were trying to come up with new stuff, is to think about that. And it could be, it's a challenging way to work.
There's this idea that one, hit game can make, $100,000, $200,000 days every day indefinitely, right? And so for us, the go big wasn't production value; it was like money making machine. And so that was the pressure that was ultimately really hard for us to deal with and to navigate, and where we made a lot of mistakes through it, right?
And the weird thing is, you're saying that wasn't coming from EA; that was internal because you'd get more from the acquisition with EA.
It was a combination, right? That was the expectation from EA. That was how they were managing their business and what they were asking for. So it certainly did not come from EA. But then we had also made this agreement and said, that's what we're going to fully buy into that. And then we were kind of leading that charge. So that was that. So like that was the go big. Again, it wasn't just like, we weren't just waking up thinking about making the earn out and making more money from the deal. But we were also thinking like, well, we got bought by EA, so we got to go big. And it's all the incentives aligned. It's easy to get blind to things. And then, and I think we destroyed a lot through that process. A lot got destroyed, a lot of kind of creativity and energy. And it became so that wasn't fun for a lot of people, and it wasn't compelling, and it felt more hollow. And so, you're never going to be able to really succeed in that environment from any metric.
Definitely one thing I would want to dispel would be the, EA gets and has gotten so much over the years for. They buy a company and then they ruin it. And there's, I don't know if you've seen, there's that famous cartoon of, famous on forums of, the latest acquisition being led to, EA has their arm around the guy, the stick figure that represents the company, and then pushes him over the cliff, and lying at the bottom of the cliff is every other game company that EA acquired and ruined. Right. That's not what I saw happen post acquisition. EA was actually pretty accommodating in a lot of ways, and they left PopCap Seattle to its own devices for the most part. What I saw change was the response and ways of working and attitude at PopCap itself, independently of EA,
right?
Because they were now under a different sort of pressure. Like, they went from, when I started, from where they were in the black and weren't beholden to anyone but themselves, to, well, now they have corporate overlords who paid a whole lot of money for you. They want a return on their investment. And there was also the promise of the second payment. Yeah. Right. So and that was really the crux of the matter. The crux of the matter was they had to make a certain amount of money by a certain time in order to get that payment. And so then it became all hands on deck of how can they make as much money as possible in this amount of time. And that is what affected the nature of what they were making. That's what affected the whether there was going to be a new game from George Fan. That affected whether they were going to make X game or whether they were going to make PVZ Farmville. And so that's where I saw things being kind of a bummer.
We made a lot of bad decisions ourselves that weren't EA's fault.
Huh. Do you think EA kind of gets a bad rap for that era of PopCap?
I think EA has acquired a lot of companies, and I think they make some mistakes that I was never able to help them communicate. I think that they're running a business at a very big scale, and that's hard. I do think that they could do more to manage the creative process in healthier ways. I don't look back and say like, oh, they broke us somehow. I think we made a lot of mistakes that were very on PopCap, and sort of like, we got bought by EA, so that, oh, that means we're going to do all the things that PopCap was great at. And some magical transference of unicorn vomit, we're also going to be great at everything EA is great at. In a structure where we were still very independent, it was just ludicrous. I do think EA, the critical side of me, I think they could communicate about their corporate values more clearly to people. I think that they are accidentally not really upfront and honest about it. And so it's really hard to transition from a studio culture at EA, from a specific studio culture, into the corporate culture. And I think if I were the most critical I am of EA, it's not an intrinsic, they're evil at all. It's they could communicate what you need to do to be successful within EA corporate as a studio and as individuals in a lot better of a way. And so I think that caused me personally a lot of challenges. I don't know if it was a PopCap challenge itself.
Yeah. So what does it take to be successful within EA then?
So they have like a set of like core leaders. This is when I was there. Maybe it's changed. I think Andrew Wilson, who took over kind of in the middle of that phase, has done a really good job in a lot of ways. So I'll use the people first example. Is they would often talk about how you treat people in the company. And in reality, I think the EA culture is like, manage your short-term business, right? Like if your short-term business is like healthy, that's when you get more latitude within the company to do things. And so what happens is, in a studio at EA, I think it's easy to then build up. It's easy to be like, look inside the studio and say, how do I make this successful? But yet it's tied to this greater ecosystem. And if all you do is try to please the corporate EA, it's not actually going to work because it's going to break this. But if all you do is this, it's going to break that. And so I think where, at least when I was there, where EA was going to have the best is, how spending time and care to communicate and get and have like a shared communication between those, such that the actions that you can take are very aligned in both directions. And if on one hand you're being like people first, but then all of the business processes are like, are you hitting your short-term numbers? There's a conflict there that I don't think helps anyone. And they don't help put people in a more elevated spot, nor do they help hit the short-term numbers. So I think that there's a lot of like corporate culture communication that and a kind of alignment at all levels of the organization that could just help everyone kind of understand what they're doing together. Confusion causes either politics or mistrust or toxicity. Because you're like, well, I don't know why that person's doing that. They must be bad.
In the effort to sort of make the company seem more complete and presentable as an acquisition target for anyone, or as an IPO offering, that layer of middle management that they brought in, like those people had wonderful intentions, but the calculus that was done to sort of consider how that might affect the core culture of the studio, the game studio, I don't think was complete. And there were a lot of efforts to try to like fix it in real time. Like, and I think like, unfortunately, and I don't know, I'm certain that I could be part of the blame for this, but like, or that I fell into this trap, but unfortunately it just turned into like toxicity. Like it just turned into people grumbling about the new people or like just weird arguments and stuff. And it just took the focus away from what it should have been, which was like, let's make these great games and let's like keep it fun and like just keep the formula, protect the formula at all costs, the secret sauce, and don't mess with the secret sauce, right?
Did you think in any way that maybe a change in studio culture could be good? Might be able to make it a little bit less of a boys club, clean up the Burrito chat line, all that fun stuff?
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. I think, and I think that goes to the, this kind of more lackadaisical, like we can laugh that we haven't done anything in the last week attitude towards more of a like, let's get down to work. I mean, there definitely was like a lot more productivity happening post acquisition. And of course, that's a good thing, right? And I didn't actually see a lot of it because I was too late in the history of the company, but I'm sure you've talked to other people. Yeah, some of the boys club stuff and some of the super inappropriate stuff. Like I know there was like a whole back channel, like forum and stuff that people posted to that was totally like not safe for work stuff all the time. But I didn't ever see it. Like it's only a rumor to me. And it was like all that stuff was like purged immediately when EA came. I will say though that all along from the time that I started, there were a lot of women at PopCap, and it felt a little more enlightened that way for the time than a lot of other companies I had seen and been at or reported on as a journalist. Like there were a lot of women there in a lot of high up places, so that was good. There wasn't a lot of diversity in terms of race, but I think that might also have been part of, I don't want to make excuses for them, but the Seattle itself is pretty homogenous. Seattle itself is pretty white. But I think that was probably more of a problem endemic to gaming in general, as it still is. That's something, again, where EA is actually quite good at that kind of stuff. EA is quite good at their diversity initiatives and their initiatives towards women. So I think that they brought some of that to PopCap as well.
I think we did okay decisions, and in many ways we were well above others. I think there's stuff around race and gender we could have handled a lot differently at PopCap, and I regret that. We always, because we were better than average, we always thought we were good.
Right.
But it turns out average was so low, we were still sucky. And I feel like we made a lot of mistakes systemically from that front. Again, we did many things well. We looked at gender. We looked at, are we paying people fair? We did do these things. So we thought we were good. But then, I was a big part of fostering a culture of drinking. Like it was a real fun place to be. Like there was a lot of drinking, right? And I didn't, and it wasn't like people were going out and getting into fights. There was all these things that I thought, well, that's okay to have a culture of drinking. But I'm sure it disenfranchised people. I'm sure I know it made the feeling of like, well, there's the club of people that hang out and those who don't. And you know, like, I'm sure we did all this stuff. And to me, if there's a thing that keeps me up, is that we had the intentions, we had the heart, if you will. We were in the position, we had the finance, we could have made real changes to ourselves and helped lead the rest of the industry, and we just didn't.
On the plus side, you know, EA thinks big, and so a lot of the stuff that they did, like Garden Warfare, you know, which is a big console title, with like, I think some of them had, I don't know, like teams of 100 plus people working on them, and that was something that PopCap would never really been able to do on our own. We're very much, you know, small scale, small teams.
I'm so proud of the team who created Garden Warfare, and it was wild and innovative and wouldn't have happened without EA, and I think that was awesome.
Was that kind of like a good example of, you knew that you had to scale up to get more of the benefits of the acquisition. So how do we scale up? Let's try and make a bigger game. And that means, okay, let's try to make a third-person shooter with this franchise.
But it was much more about the game plan, something that everyone thought would be cool and coming together from a game design standpoint than it was like a business thing or go big.
When Plants vs. Zombies Garden Warfare was still just something that was being talked about. It was still... I don't know if this has been talked about by others, but like the first iteration of that actually came from American McGee, of all people.
What?
So yeah, American McGee and his group over in China they had developed prototypes for a 3D PVZ as a shooter thing. It never saw the light of day, but I was actually there and saw it running. So that notion had been around for a while before it turned into Garden Warfare. And I remember there was also a prototype, and I can't remember who the ones were who made it, but the plants all had guns, like actual like firearms, like armaments. And I remember the folks at PopCap having to tell these guys, like, well, okay, first of all, the plants are weapons, right? Plants, so you're missing the point on that. But also, like, we can't have guns in our games.
Yeah,
we are PopCap, and we can't have firearms in our games.
So the American McGee prototype, did BlackRock know about that, or they pitched Garden Warfare separately? Do you have any idea?
That I don't know.
Okay.
That you would have to talk to others, like what the course was. Like, I have no idea if that became that or if it was just a whole separate initiative.
Okay.
Or not. Yeah. It was super exciting in those couple weeks that was happening. Like, I wished it. Well, who knows how that would have turned out.
They did a great job translating it into that family-friendly kind of shooter.
But it wasn't a big development within PopCap at all.
No, I think it was only a few people actually in PopCap. They just managed it. It was like the main franchise manager for PVZ and kind of stuff, being like,
right,
and like the art director, making sure that it was staying within brand.
I actually thought Garden Warfare was great when it finally launched.
Yeah, absolutely.
Super fun. And I wish that franchise had actually been bigger than it became. I think it has a nice core audience, but I thought it could have been bigger.
In this era, a big moment was the Peggle 2 reveal. I'm sure you're sick about talking about it, but do you want to just walk us through your history of that fateful day?
So we wanted to announce Garden Warfare and do a big deal. And we felt that like it was a pretty big deal, right? And it was for E3. And so they asked me to be on stage front, come out in a zombie mask, which I said yes to. We were doing rehearsals, and Garden Warfare was so good, so exciting to announce. We were like, well, we can't announce Peggle 2. And we made a mistake. We thought that the iconography was going to read so easily. We had all the rainbows and stuff happening. And we realized it was just, people might not get how big of a moment Peggle 2 was. Because we thought it was pretty big. And Peggle 2 is amazing. I mean, that team did so many amazing things in Peggle 2. It's undescribable how proud I am of what they did around music and graphics, and just, I mean, they just did the sound effects. It's a work of art from a sound design and music standpoint in my mind. And so we were really excited about it. And I was like, it needs a little more energy. And so I'm like, what if I did like a jump, like a Hadouken? and oh no, and so I just did this jump, and I was somehow in really good shape at the time. It was like the best shape of my life. So I could do a decent jump. And then I did the jump.
And how do you feel about it today?
Pretty good. I mean, there were some cool memes, right? Like, I feel like that was my little claim to fame in life. It was pretty untoxic, right? I mean, there's always going to be people making fun of it, but it's like, cool, make fun of it, right? Like, I was like a big dork. But it wasn't like toxic mockery or anything like that.
Right. Healthy level
It's easy
of
to
mockery.
get on the wrong side of the internet.
One thing that happens when the company gets bought is the people who formed the company and ran the company, they want out.
Yeah.
Right. That's part of the reason it's happening. Like, they certainly had nothing to prove anymore. Kapalka and Vechey and all those guys they had nothing to prove anymore. They have made games that are going to stand the test of time. They're awesome classics, and they made a ton of money. They had nothing to prove anymore. So why shouldn't they reap the benefits and retire early or go do something else and leave the company in other people's hands? They had done what they had set out to do. But and so they didn't necessarily leave, but they were doing less. They were less of a presence at the company. And when that happens, things do change. That is why company culture changes, because there's less of those people like physically at the office. There's less of their daily presence guiding things. There's now people who were not part of the legacy at all, who work in another state, who are working for a giant corporation, who are now chiming in at your meetings.
Right.
Like, it is going to change whether you like it or not. Those people are going to make a difference. Doesn't make them evil, doesn't make the acquisition bad. It just means things are going to be different.
Brian Feet left to, I don't know what Brian does, race cars, I think.
Oh, really? He's into
bikes.
racing?
Like, yeah, he dabbled in lots of other hobbies towards the end there. So as soon as like the main founder started leaving and like those higher up people just started being like moving on, that's when you started seeing more change at the company.
Do you have thoughts on modern PopCap?
Well, I'm not. It's modern PopCap is it's in a bit of a weird quantum state right now.
Yeah.
They kind of I believe they kind of canceled PVZ3 and are reassigning it somewhere. So I'm not really sure exactly, and because of the pandemic, it's kind of hard to know exactly, what's going on. So I think some people, I still know some people are working there, but I'm unclear if some people have been reassigned or moved around. So yeah. And then with Glue getting bought by EA, I wouldn't be shocked to see basically the Glue studio taking over some of the mobile developments of PopCap titles. So I wouldn't be surprised to see Glue, working on a PVZ or a Bejeweled or some other title. So yeah, so I think PopCap, in whatever state it exists in, is it's a bit hard to tell from the outside what exactly is going on. But I'm hoping that the games will sort of survive and evolve into some new form.
I would actually like to see them just be able to sort of have a second wind of either new IP or like cool new versions of existing IP. I don't know if it's in the cards for them. I don't have any connection with the folks working there anymore. I don't know what they're working on, but wouldn't it be great to see like a PVZ3 and a Peggle 3 and all of these things? And I would like to see them take chances again. That would be the coolest thing to me. The coolest thing to me would be is if they could release a new IP that was as awesome as the ones that we saw made them great in the first place. I think if they put out a game that was like as fun as PVZ, that was brand new,
yeah,
none of us would say like, well, EA owns them, so f it. Like, we would all download it and play it to death.
Yeah.
Right? I would.
Yeah, or just put Plants vs. Zombies on Switch. Just something clean like that. Everybody would buy it.
Why is it not on Switch? That's crazy.
It is absurd not to have that first game on there.
I hadn't even thought about that. I would buy that. I would pay money for that today.
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody would. It's infuriating.
But honestly, I don't think there's even a lot of people at what remains of PopCap that even know how to compile those old games. Like, they moved engine. Like, I was still there. We switched to Unity and stopped using our own internal stuff. And then I think most of the C++ devs all left. So I think the source and stuff probably just sits in a vault somewhere. I know it's pretty small, whatever's left there. It's like back down to under 50 people.
Oh, really?
That are yeah, and I don't know if they're even how many games they're even working on. What EA wanted more than anything was the franchises themselves, not the studio specifically.
As far as I know, they've basically let all the other games die on the vine. Okay, I'll illustrate that this way.
Sure.
The entire time I was at PopCap, mine was the only phone number and email address on the website. But in the PopCap days, like as soon as that was on there, and certainly growing over time, I got calls from everybody. I mean, potential partners, customers, whatever. I still get calls for PopCap customer service. Now, it's down to maybe 2 a month, but 3 years ago, it was 8 or 10 a month. And that's how I know the games are really dying, is because no one's calling me. If you call Microsoft and say, I'm having a Windows issue with a PopCap game, they will give you my phone number. Right now, do it. I'm telling you, you'll sit on hold for 4 hours, so don't do it. But they will give you my phone number. EA, at one point, I think, was giving out my phone number for PopCap customer service. And these people, you know, most of them are elderly. They all say, my disk has stopped working. And I have to say, well, I think the server that used to check that registration code on your disk, that server doesn't exist anymore. I don't know how you can get Bookworm Adventures to play anymore. I'm sorry. I wish I could tell you.
This is an impossible question, but if you had to sum it all up, what's the legacy of PopCap? What's the story of PopCap? What was it all about, man?
Oh gosh, well, I mean, I always felt that, you know, PopCap and other video game makers, I always felt that we were producing a lot of joy for a lot of people, yeah, at a fairly efficient rate.
Yeah, it seems like you removed some layers of complexity in video games. It got right down to, you know, mastering feedback. What will make players happy? Let's still have some gameplay there. What is the most efficient game design we can create? And it paid off.
Yeah, I definitely, you know, we didn't want to only cater to some small segment of hardcore players, even though, you know, I am a fairly, you know, hardcore gamer myself, but you know, it didn't seem fair that, you know, people like your mom or, you know, other, you know, people who are not going to, you know, get as into that, should also be able to play games. And yeah, in some ways, I mean, I think we've reached that future faster than expected. So I'm happy that we were able to help kind of usher that era in.
I do know that when we started PopCap, the idea that games could be for everyone was often laughable. It wasn't going to be a big business. There's always going to be an asterisk, like games for girls, which we always thought was so condescending. And I still think it's condescending. But now no one questions that. You don't ask, do you play video games? You assume everyone plays video games. In the same way you assume everyone's watched a movie in the last 10 years or seen some show, right? And so video games are now that, right? Where everyone plays video games to some extent. And so like, I don't think we're the only ones who took a part of that, who did that, but I think we played a part in that. So that's as much as I can get you.
Yeah, it's a mission accomplished overall, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Like we said, we think everyone will like playing video games. And it turns out everyone likes playing video games, so at least we were right. Maybe we didn't have anything to do with it, but at least we were right about that.
John and Jason, if you're listening, find Brian. He's probably in a rainforest somewhere, but find him and let's get the band back together. We could do this all again. There's no law says we got to have microtransactions.
I mean, that's what I always get back to in my head. If I ever get, you know, bitter in my head about what happened, is I remember Jason Kapalka and his floppy disk with Bejeweled in, you know, with the name scribbled on it. And like how he just had this, you know, this pie in the sky desire of, I'm going to quit my game journalism gig and make it in games, to doing something unbelievably phenomenal. Like where he took it from those roots is such a great success story.
I think that it's a really interesting story. It's a super unique studio. And from my seat at Microsoft, we did due diligence on, because I was in the publishing group. We worked with almost every studio in the industry, right? And including Rare and Lionhead, and it's like studios that kind of are on the same level as PopCap when it comes to like quirky and dedicated to doing their own thing and all that stuff. And just PopCap was absolutely unique and original, and I don't think there'll ever be another one like it.
When the game company is like cool to start with, it's just going to attract more cool people. And that place was just a magnet for very creative, fun types.
PopCap was just different. It was the right time. It was the right games. It was the right people. It was a perfect storm that makes every other job in a way just not as much fun.
Well, I tell you, I would go right back to it if I could. I love that company. I love those people. It's the proudest time of my work life was my time at PopCap.
Oh, so
it was an incredible time. I'd do it all again with those guys in a second if I could. I keep trying to recreate it other places. It's not as fun. I'm just going to say that.
I think when it comes down to it, great game companies are companies who make great teams, who make great games, who then are successful. It has to be that way around, right? Too many game companies try and be successful by making games, by hiring people. It's the wrong way around. I always say PopCap had that right from the get-go. So it's surprising how few people have realized it. I'm like, hey, they were doing that how long ago,
I want people to realize that you can have a massively successful organization like PopCap, make amazing games, and at the same time, really take care of people and care about them. And it wasn't just because of the bottom line. It wasn't, obviously there's a business payoff for people feeling like they're cared about and all that stuff. Like we had very little turnover. And there were people that would leave and come back because they were just like, oh no, it's not nearly as good out there. We're totally going to, we got to get back to our family, That's the stuff that really matters, that's the stuff that people are going to remember, that we were there for them, that we cared about them, that when they needed us the most, we were there for them. And then we made some really great games.
Every time, someone's trying to convince me that the best way to make games is pure analytics, I'll be like, but in PopCap, PopCap, you don't get to Plants vs. Zombies by A/B testing alone, You can make whatever game you want, make it good enough that people will come,
Sunflower. One, two, three. There's a zombie on your lawn. There's a zombie on your lawn. There's a zombie on your lawn. We don't want zombies on that lawn. I know your type, tall, dark, and dead. You wanna bite all the petals off of my head and then eat the brains of the one who planted me here. I'm just a sunflower, but see me power an entire infantry. You like the taste of brains, we don't like zombies. I used to play football. Road cones protect my head. I have a screen door shield. We are the undead. There's a zombie on your lawn. There's a zombie on your lawn. There's a zombie on your lawn. We don't want zombies on that lawn. I think it's time to reevaluate. I know you have a lot of food on your plate. Brains are quite rich in cholesterol. You're dead, so it doesn't matter. Instead, we'll use the solar power to make a lawn defense at any hour. I like your tricycle. There's butter on my head.
If you are sick of snark, clickbait, and an avalanche of movie news, you can help support independent games media by subscribing to MinnMax's YouTube channel here or checking out the benefits over on Patreon. It's a nice clean handshake. You support us, and we won't make dumb, condescending stuff for you. Your support helps us continue our mission of focusing on games, friends, and getting better. Patreon.com/MinnMax with 2 N's. We'd appreciate it.